Another long day of hard work. Now I can get home and play a game to relax. I'm tired of losing in this game. What could go wrong if I use a few cheats? Nothing, just getting thrown into the game world. Being cursed by a crazy goddess who gives me supernatural powers. Being hunted by thieves who kill me in the end. Facing wild monsters, and on top of that, meeting dangerous women, and so begins the story of hardships. This story begins with a young man running through the snow. While reflecting on his life, that man was being chased. In the midst of his escape, compared his existence to an egg. He made that comparison at the exact moment his foot was struck by an arrow. It was then that he likened himself to a boiled egg. Right after being hit in the heel, he fell face first into the frozen ground. He himself didn't fully understand the meaning of those words. Echoing in his mind, however, the end seemed near as the hunter pressed a blade against his neck. The protagonist knew that in front of that enemy, there was no point in resisting. He was completely at their mercy. After the man ordered an inspection of his belongings, they found an ancient relic in his possession. Even seeing that, the young man was unable to flee as he was seriously wounded. Those men still kept him detained. The hunter, however, was not satisfied with mere plunder. He also wanted to take his life. Even after being dismembered, the protagonist still whispered, asking the mother of corruption not to be angered. As he murmured words to that hand, it slowly crawled toward his body, and upon reaching him it grabbed him tightly, still repeating words in a whispering tone. It was determined to make him eliminate those people. She was the deity that dwelt within him. Amid that unsettling scene, the protagonist held his own head by the hair. As he spoke, he said he had already absorbed the contents of the relic. He spoke those words as he reattached his head to his body. That was why he had that hand which followed him everywhere. As he held it, it climbed up his body. And worst of all, he had lost money. The protagonist revealed that when he turned 30, his life changed drastically. Now he was tired and too busy to play. He only remembered buying a game, but couldn't recall the name or why he had bought it. He just kept playing as the priest of corruption. He explained that the priest of corruption was a complicated character. Hard to play, his performance was poor, but there was nothing he could do. His heart would always race upon entering that world. He reported that, after acquiring all the materials, evolutions, and completing all class missions, he was startled by the computer screen, as he suddenly found himself transformed into the priest of corruption. Soon after, a portal mysteriously opened and he was sucked in, literally entering the game back in the present. In that snowy landscape, the sacred hand held him with a gentle expression. He thought that the shrill voice, like heavy metal screams, could only belong to the goddess. He remembered that when he woke up in the game, all he had was the habit of the order of corruption, and the hand of the mother of corruption embedded in his chest. Her presence was unmistakable. Accepting that he had entered a game was surprisingly easy for him, and he quickly adapted according to the game's description. The priest of corruption was a human, genetically modified by drugs. As he walked through the snow, he reflected that this had granted him extraordinary physical abilities. His senses were heightened, and his body could only be destroyed by a deity. At times he thought there might be something wrong with his mind. Upon seeing an animal tearing apart its prey, he realized he could never stand the liquid of life. Grotesque scenes like that no longer affected him. However, his greatest problem was that his body no longer felt anything, not even the taste of food. At another point, after some time, he was finally about to obtain his priest identity. As soon as he got that identity, he went to look for a job at a guild. While he waited at the counter, the attendant informed him that she would perform a verification. After handling some papers, he remained still waiting. He pretended to be a member of the Order of Preservation, because if he belonged to another order, they might become suspicious. He would be marked with a seal that only members of that order could see. The seal of punishment, however. The goddess he served was lenient when it came to disguises. Besides, the order of corruption was the enemy of all others, which would make him a target of widespread hatred. And there was also the fact that he was the only living follower of the mother of corruption. After ending his thoughts about the disguise, the young attendant offered him a job. She said she was pleased to be able to work with him. When she noticed that the protagonist could read and understand all the written terms, She was impressed as most asked her to read them aloud. For him, though, that was not difficult. Since entering the game he had already mastered the basics. After reading through, he was left with a single question. Before setting out to complete the mission, he received half of the reward. While the young woman explained the reasons, the protagonist silently conversed with his inner goddess. After listening for a while, he stepped outside while the hand still tried to squeeze him. During the struggle, he was surprised by someone calling him Father Marnak. He was a chubby-faced young man with a pompadour hairstyle and a friendly appearance. As the protagonist listened to him, the only thing he truly understood was his name. Following the young man named Pierre, he talked about monsters and ghosts. Another man appeared calling for Pierre. This one had a scar on his face and a stern look. Pierre apologized to the protagonist, saying he needed to go on ahead. Left behind, the priest was still dealing with the hand that insisted on eliminating everyone around. He told the goddess he needed coins to survive the winter. After that, the hand calmed down and he noticed its silence. Placing his hand over his chest where it resided, he asked her not to be sad. But no matter what he said, she always wanted someone eliminated. The protagonist, however, shifted focus, asking about the judgment of those individuals. They had their own way of communicating. She used her fingers to signal numbers. He knew that by eliminating everyone and sending them to the mother of corruption, he could receive divinity. Divinity was granted according to the number of fingers she showed. For each soul's worth, he needed to collect 10,000 divinity to gain an authority. Thanks to the system, he could absorb divinity from sacred relics, and thus obtain divine authority. There were 12 relics in total, and the Mother of Corruption had promised that, if he collected them all, his wish would be granted. Surely he would ask for the return of his sense of taste, as he deeply missed savoring anything with flavor. While thinking about that, Pierre returned, saying the captain had ordered not to disturb him. He faithfully repeated the superior's words. The priest was not to be bothered. The protagonist, as kind as ever, replied that it was all right and that there was no need to worry. Still, he kept a close watch on everyone, and noticed something strange was happening. Suddenly they were all caught in an ambush, with arrows fired from multiple directions. With a swift movement, the protagonist pulled Pierre to protect him. He threw the young man aside, keeping him from being hit by the rain of arrows. However, the projectiles kept coming. Several struck the protagonist's body in multiple spots. Pierre watched in shock as the priest was severely hit. The ambushers fired more arrows, closely observing the effects. After falling to the ground, struck repeatedly, the priest lay motionless. He imagined they might be bandits, while the hand begged him to kill them all. He knew the Mother of Corruption wanted him to pretend to be dead. In order to absorb everyone's divinity, he considered this the hardest task of all. Rising up, he told the goddess she already knew who he truly was inside. After that, he stood up fully and spotted a sword nearby. With the weapon in hand, he declared to the goddess that he would never do things her way, and as he said that he was already assuming a combat stance, gripping the sword firmly, it was then that he lunged forward, sword in hand, to fight in his own way. Meanwhile, the enemies lying in ambush couldn't understand why that man was coming toward them. He quickly closed in and began cutting them down without hesitation. The others, seeing the first one get struck, immediately grew alert toward the man. Realizing he wouldn't stop for anything, the blond man with a scar gritted his teeth. He ordered everyone to leave the priest to him, and after dealing with the others, to join the fight. The protagonist watched as the enemy approached with determination. Soon the two exchanged sword strikes with growing intensity. The blonde, scarred man stared at the priest with a wide smile on his lips. Meanwhile, the protagonist stared back intently, gripping his sword with conviction. The fight went on with increasingly brutal blows between the two. At one point both stepped back, observing each other closely. The protagonist noticed that the goddess's hand was beginning to assess the enemy before him. The blond man with a crazed look wanted to know who the priest was talking to. Once again the two clashed swords fiercely. Tall blonde enemy believed he could easily defeat the priest, but the battle was surprisingly even. As soon as the goddess's hand completed its analysis, it revealed to the priest that the man before him had a value of 2.5. The protagonist couldn't understand how a mere mercenary had reached the level of a forest guard. Smiling, he thought to himself that this game was completely unbalanced. Even so, he resumed his offensive stance. The enemy quickly advanced, striking with force and cutting through the priest's sword, which fell into the snow. Now the blonde enemy, smiling, believed he had won by destroying the priest's weapon. As the protagonist examined the damage to his sword, the enemy remarked that this was why he preferred stainless steel. He also said there was nothing special about that priest. The blonde added that this would be his last job, before leaving that place forever. Protagonist then dropped the remaining part of the sword into the snow, and said he could try something different. It was better to end that matter there. While they were both still smiling, however, the protagonist wanted to make an offer. He asked the enemy to leave that life behind and walk away. With a serene face, the protagonist stated that if he agreed, he would go easy in the fight. The man before him didn't believe that priest was being serious. They weren't just going to accept it and walk away. While the protagonist smiled, he was struck by an arrow. The blonde man turned around and, seeing his allies, said he thought they wouldn't arrive in time. As the protagonist fell lying in the snow, the enemy held his sword and talked with his comrades about eliminating everyone. Soon after, they were startled by a voice, asking if they had really eliminated everyone. Lifting his head slowly, the protagonist wanted to know why they were so surprised. The blonde man watched in disbelief as the man who had taken an arrow to the head rose before them, standing in the snow, mocking the situation. The protagonist said someone had survived after all, holding and breaking with his bare hands the arrow embedded in his head. He said it was probably the first time they'd seen something like that. Now before him everyone stood in shock, and the blonde man began to sweat nervously. The protagonist clasped his hands together and declared that he had already given them a chance, but in return he got an arrow to the head. Upon hearing that, the blonde enemy widened his blue eyes. He ordered them to shoot that man again. Even seeing the green aura surrounding him, the archers began firing arrows once more. As he was struck, the protagonist offered reverence to the mother of corruption. Even under attack, he prayed to his goddess, while the enemies could hardly believe he was still standing. As his prayer continued, the enemies tried to flee under orders from their leader. However, an invisible force prevented them from moving further away. From that place, the protagonist knew his prayers had been heard. That was the barrier separating the living from divine presence, an authority that a priest of corruption needed to activate before unleashing his true power. That barrier prevented enemies from escaping or hiding from the divinity of corruption. Now, their leader realized there was no other choice but to draw their weapons. Their only chance was to try and break through the barrier. But when they looked behind, they felt a sinister energy. All of them screamed for the captain. A monster with a lizard-like appearance appeared, walking toward them. It was something immense, incredibly powerful. Everyone wondered what that creature was. The giant monster attacked, breaking the ground near them. With wide eyes, they now knew they were facing a true monster. It opened its mouth and unleashed a deafening, maddening roar. Desperate, they all tried to escape the limits of the barrier. Warriors who had once acted brave were now crying in fear, terrified for their lives. Meanwhile, the protagonist just smiled as he listened to his enemies, begging for mercy. After some time, footsteps on the snow showed that the protagonist had eliminated them all. After the confrontation, he wondered if he should collect the divinities. He wanted to know if by collecting them from their bodies, they wouldn't vanish. Now he tried to think of a plan. He couldn't be careless, as the guild might investigate. On the ground, he found Pierre fallen after being struck by an arrow. The protagonist decided to end all that and let Pierre rest in peace. He would do his best to save that man's life, and thus improve his own reputation. Once more, he asked his goddess for help. After some time, someone was seen holding a chalice. A woman asked what had happened to the individual who had stolen the relic. She was told that the person had been eliminated on the spot. Upon hearing that the head had been separated from the body, she wanted to know what happened to the remains. When the priest turned his back, a young man called for his attention. Looking at the chalice, he warned that it could return. From that point on, the priest considered setting out on a pilgrimage. Upon hearing that, the servant thought the decision was quite sudden. He asked if it had to do with the prophecy. The blue-haired priest's answer was yes. It was exactly because of the prophecy besides that there was someone he needed to find. As he walked through the snow carrying Pierre in his arms, it was narrated that 10 years ago, all religious orders had received a prophecy. The end would wear the shell of life and fall upon the world. As they saw the priest approaching with Pierre, the guards came to meet him. The protagonist was surprised by someone calling out to him, saying he had just returned. While the guards carried Pierre inside, a red-haired young woman announced that she had already received permission to pass. During the conversation, she told the protagonist that she never would have imagined, judging by his appearance, that he was so strong. Hearing that, he felt a bit awkward but only looked at her. When she mentioned that she knew what he was carrying in a sack, she claimed that was the source of all the problems. She thought it would be better if instead of carrying it around, he left it with the guild. While they walked through the city, the young woman asked if he had a place to sleep. She said that if he didn't, he could stay at her house. The young man simply looked at her, slightly blushing while his deity in rage wanted to eliminate her. Despite the goddess being against it, the young man ended up accepting the invitation of the beautiful redhead, and now he found himself lying down, with the goddess's hand resting on his chest, looking upward with a friendly face. He thought he had simply accepted the invitation of a lovely lady, but a sound coming from the door caught his attention, making him look in that direction. It was the redhead standing at the door, greeting the priest with the door only slightly open. She said she wanted to let him rest. He put on his slippers, and heard her say she needed him to pay attention to something. Standing before the girl who was still at the door, he asked what the problem was. After she said that the Lord wanted to see him, he made a surprised face as the young woman remained at the door. He asked if she knew why while she explained. Far from there, a well-kept mansion could be seen inside. Someone was having tea. While the butler explained that the priest had arrived, Floor simply asked the butler to leave, and he lowered his head respectfully, obeying the order. Lord Guiz was a man with black hair and a black beard, who watched the priest with a strange gaze. The protagonist noticed when the Lord asked if he had witnessed his brother's final moments, and when the Lord offered the protagonist tea, he simply gave a wicked smile. He remembered when the mother of corruption saw the Lord for the first time. She had drawn an X because of that. He already knew that man wasn't human and decided to confront him. The demon, realizing that the priest knew exactly who he was, had his eyes turn red. That was how the two of them communicated. When she marked someone with an X, it meant that person wasn't human. In that land, there were many demons disguised as humans to live among them. Although demons were stronger than any other being, some of them did nothing on their own to become part of that world. They had no choice but to make pacts with the existences, and that was why demons liked humans so much. However, the gods hated the demons, because they gave as much as they took from their servants. As a result, the gods declared that not only the demons, but all their followers would be called demons. These existences were considered evil. And that was how the demon hunt by the priest began. The protagonist, closing his eyes, reflected on this, since demon contractors were a difficult class, and people usually avoided them. But he remembered why he chose to play that class. Now, in the office of that lord, the two remained silent until the Lord said, "Wow." Seeming excited, remembering his brother, he said, "It was thanks to the deceased that the priest now stood before him, with a teacup in hand." The Lord admired how the priest managed to see through the disguise. With a wicked look and fingers interlocked, the demon said he could be called sneaky. However, the protagonist closed his eyes and told the man that he was a priest, serving the mother of corruption. That information left the demon intrigued, as he believed that deity no longer had any followers. Excited, he asked the guests to take a seat, since they were the only ones in that place. He said he wanted to be honest, and revealed that he hadn't invited him there by chance. As the man spoke, the protagonist noticed that he remained seated calmly. The Lord wanted to know about the captain of the mercenary group. He wanted to know exactly how he had died. The protagonist simply listened, while the Lord said he would ensure payment for his efforts. Those words seemed to please the player, who gave a slight smile while the Lord spoke. The protagonist thought it had been an unfortunate event. Galade complained that during that winter there was no work. The Lord had tried to arrange something under the table. No one expected the young man to die in the process. Now the Lord said that this thing called life in his eyes was something very difficult. He said this while looking out the window, After the protagonist left the Lord's presence, he already had a small pouch filled with gold coins. He knew that the Lord wasn't trying to manipulate him with that money. The gold was simply a way to obtain the truth. Walking away from the castle, he stated that he wasn't a greedy priest. Quite the opposite, seeing that the mother of corruption was angry. He held her hand and, caressing it, said he didn't want to see her upset. The hand seemed to want him to keep talking, so he brought it to his mouth and coughed. The protagonist said, "There was something that didn't rust and lasted just as long as gold." With a smile and blushing cheeks, he declared to that hand that it was his love for the goddess. That hand seemed touched as it began to tremble. Then the protagonist placed her hand close to his own heart, and he continued saying that to him, she would always be the most important thing. As he walked, he told her that for that reason, she didn't need to worry so much. Sometime later he returned to the inn, and the red-haired girl was happy to see him again. She waved to the side and asked him to greet the priests from the sect of teaching. With a cheerful expression, he thought that he didn't know what that sect was doing there. However, his eyes looked in that direction. It seemed like something was wrong. The look was also returned by one of the members of the sect. Protagonist already knew the moment he saw them. The mother had told him one of them possessed a sacred relic, and now the protagonist was analyzing the three before him. Someone walking toward him said that it was the result of a life dedicated to justice. The protagonist just watched while the person continued, saying he never expected to see a priest of preservation. Introducing himself, he said he was the weight on the scale of retribution. He could be called Orvis. That man had a piercing gaze, shining armor, and carried a very striking weapon. He said the other, a large man with white hair, was named Cornelius, and the young woman was Patina. They all greeted the priest by placing their hands on their chests. He returned the greeting in the same way, saying it was a pleasure to meet them. The red-haired girl mentioned a blonde woman who was eyeing some books in the library. The protagonist felt a certain relief, knowing there were other sects and priests present. He thought that, even if not at that moment, he would have several chances to take that relic for himself. However, there was a problem. When he absorbed a relic's divinity, something always ended up going wrong. Now he wondered whether he was truly a priest of corruption, or just a villain of corruption. The priests greeted the protagonist and said they had to leave. They were going to greet the Lord. Orvis told the protagonist that they would have a serious talk the next time they met. As they left, protagonist noticed that they all carried identical weapons and were heading to greet the Lord. The redhead told the protagonist that their guild usually provided shelter for priests at an affordable price. Sweating, he asked if she was going to make him pay for the night he spent at the inn. Smiling, she asked if he thought she would let him stay there, purely out of self-interest. In truth, that was what he thought. He said no, blushing slightly. The redhead continued, saying she had her own reasons for helping him, because she always turning her hand to the side. She said she wanted him to prevent the food from spoiling. Getting closer, she asked if he could cast a preservation blessing over the food. Blushing even more, he stepped away from the girl and asked why she was whispering that. After embarrassing the priest, the girl gave a wide smile. Right after she asked why he looked bored, someone came through the door and guessed that the two got along well, since they were joking around. The priest asked why that man hadn't gone with the others. It was Cornelius, the white-haired priest. He said he had no choice because of his people. He said that from the outside, he had asked the group to show respect in his name as well. The redhead believed that Lord Tradon wouldn't care about that sort of thing. When she said that, the two looked at her, and she explained that despite the Lord seeming cold, he did a good job. She added that, of course, she knew how to separate work from personal life. She warned both of them that, since there were many people who supported the Lord, they should stay quiet. The white-haired priest wanted to know more about the Lord. He seemed interested. The girl smiled as she talked about the Lord, and the priest simply observed everything. At a certain point, he also had a question and wanted the girl to reveal something to him. Smiling, he asked the other priest why he had given up on visiting the Lord. He, with a wide smile, replied that they were currently following a prophecy. They had received it 10 years ago, and now the priest believed that the end of the world was hiding. The protagonist broke into a sweat as he realized they were there, because they believed the Lord was a demon. In another scene already near the Lord, the two priests were walking to greet him when the relic began to shine. Upon seeing the glow, they knew if a sacred relic shone near someone, it meant that person was a demon. Now, with the relic in hand, they knew they had to destroy him. The demon knew he could no longer hide, so he revealed his true form. A burst of fire was noticed by both the protagonist and the other priest. A creature resembling a mutant lizard emerged from within the Lord's mansion. The priest looked in fear in that direction, but the other priest had already expected it. Inside the Lord's mansion, a priest wielded the scales of retribution, a weapon resembling a hammer. That was one of the 3 priests of wisdom who were facing the demon. During the battle, he alternated between axe and sword, until he drove the blade into the top of the massive creature's head. A mix of dust, lightning, and all kinds of devastation could be seen from a distance as the priest challenged the demonic entity. The priest, accompanying the protagonist, explained that the glow in the sky was caused by the hammer of punishment wielded by Orvis. He said Orvis was probably fighting a demon, and pointing in that direction, expressed his desire to go help him. Marnak, however, walked in the opposite direction and said the priest could go ahead. Had catch up soon. He returned to the inn, calling for the red-haired girl. Eren, startled to see him, ran toward him wanting to know what was going on. However, when the protagonist entered through the door, with a strange expression, he only wanted to know where it was. Holding the girl in his arms, he asked where the medical center treating Pierre was. Eren, not quite understanding the question, only watched as the priest leaped from there to a safer place. He was fleeing the rubble and destruction, acting as if he had little time. The young woman carried by him watched all the chaos around. People were screaming for help. In the distance, a massive reptile could be seen, the demon's current form, with the priest on top of it wielding his hammer. The redhead screamed in terror, trying to warn the priest about the monster. The reptile, besides being gigantic, was extremely muscular and completely uncontrollable. Marnak told her to forget the monster and just say where Pierre was. Seeing the young man's concern, she pointed in the direction with her finger. The protagonist, determined to protect him, stared ahead, repeating Pierre's name in his mind. Upon entering the location, he found Pierre lying on a mattress. Almost everything around was destroyed, but the young man remained calm, asleep. The protagonist looked at him and thought he couldn't let him die, especially after barely managing to save him. Despite Pierre being burly, Marnak threw him over his shoulder with ease. He then asked Eren to climb onto his back, as he could no longer carry her in his arms. The young woman, embarrassed by the closeness and hugging the priest's neck, blushed slightly. With a leap, he dashed forward at high speed, determined to complete his mission. He ran as fast as possible. The young woman, as she was being carried, seemed deep in thought. Then she told the priest she knew a shortcut. Shouting through the wind, he asked where it was. She pointed with her finger and said it was just straight ahead in that direction. As they approached, she warned that they would have to pass through a house with a secret passage. The door was locked. That wasn't an obstacle for Marna, who kicked it down. Eren, seeing the scene, was visibly embarrassed while trying to keep balance and speed, slipping slightly on the floor. The priest kept going steadily. The young woman thought his movements were rather rough. Looking back at the destroyed door, she muttered softly that she really thought he was very strong. He set her down and told her that if things got worse, she should escape through the secret passage. She was confused about what he intended, and why he wouldn't leave with them. Moments later, he explained that he needed to go back and help the other priests, leaving Eren and Pierre away from the chaos with a chance of survival. He set off once again. Eren only watched his back as he ran, and thought about how incredibly strong he was. After running for a long time, the priest reached a place and his expression grew somber. He had arrived too late. On the ground, he found one of the priests badly wounded. It shook him deeply. He approached the burly man with white hair and a horn on his forehead. It was Cornelius, even weakened. Cornelius recognized Marnak. As he approached, the protagonist looked at him with sorrow. Aware of the severity of the injuries, he knew there was nothing he could do. He spoke to him while he was still breathing, fearing that the end was near. The big man said his companion Patina had died. The priest, looking to the side, saw the young woman's body brutally thrown against the wall. He asked Corneus if there was any other way to defeat the demon. Corneus revealed that there was still another relic. The white sword it was with the priest Orvis, who had managed to stab it into the demon's head. He said that if Marnak took the sword and drove it directly into the creature's brain, he could defeat it. After revealing this, his eyes rolled back and his hand fell to the ground, kicking up a bit of dust. The protagonist remained by the body for a while. Then he called upon his goddess, the mother of corruption, and said he was going to collect something from that man. Meanwhile, Orvis was still fiercely fighting the demon. Using the hammer of retribution, he tried to drive the sword even deeper. However, the more he insisted, the more furious the reptile became. The creature thrashed violently, swinging its tail and limbs in all directions. From a distance, the protagonist ran with all his strength, believing this was his only chance. He leaped and managed to stab another sword near the creature's tail. Up ahead, he spotted the priest with the sword he needed. That's when he noticed the reptile behaving strangely. This made Marnak uneasy, fearing what might happen. The reptile firmly planted its feet on the ground. As it opened its mouth wide, Marnak recognized it. That was the death spin. The attack flung him far away, making him crash down violently, almost out of strength. He told the mother of corruption that he was fine lying on the ground. His legs badly injured, he admitted that she was right. Blessings came with disasters. Despite the pain, there was a faint smile on his face. He felt he had succeeded. Looking to the side, he saw the relic nearby, which made him breathe a sigh of relief. With the relic in his hands, he thought this had all turned into an interesting twist. Placing the sword against his chest, he declared to the goddess of corruption that he would offer her that sacred relic. He made a request, a new authority. At that moment, a strange hand seemed to emerge from his pocket. As he handed the relic to the goddess of corruption, the protagonist asked her to release another seal. He believed that every sacred relic contained enough divinity to grant a new authority. That one in particular contained 11,723 units of divinity, and that left him satisfied. As he was now surrounded by an intense green energy, the seal should be released. So he asked the goddess what power he had obtained. She, however, simply jumped off his chest and started running, tapping her fingers hard against the ground as she moved away. The protagonist said he'd be happy if she could support him. Even from that distance, he confessed, he felt joy in seeing her growth. Even so, he admitted they weren't in the best situation, and for that reason he would stop playing around. Changing his tone, he called for the mother of corruption, and thus the goddess listened. Levitating before her, he declared that he would offer another 10,000 units of divinity in exchange for a new authority. After everything was completed, he seemed more satisfied. He liked the newly acquired authority, and now beneath his feet a magic circle appeared. It was the script of corruption. The effects of that authority were simple, yet still powerful, and that made him show a curious expression. The moment the script was activated, metaphysical tattoos in dark green tones began to spread across his body, enhancing his physical abilities. He commented to the goddess that it wasn't a bad authority. He believed it could be useful in the current situation. Standing up, he brushed the dust off his clothes and announced that his legs were healed. Looking to the side, something caught his attention. It was the body of the priest Orvis, now lying on the ground, apparently lifeless. The protagonist deduced that he had been thrown by the reptile. During the battle, they had likely fallen around the same time. With sorrow, he wished him to rest in peace. Even so, he decided to collect the divinity from the body, and as he approached, he made the necessary gesture. The green energy began to flow. Meanwhile, the massive reptile remained furious, its glowing red eyes shining intensely. It caused destruction with its tail and heavy steps, keeping the protagonist on alert. Something about that situation felt profoundly wrong. The priest stared at the creature, trying to understand its motivation. He knew that the ones responsible for bringing the sacred leaf to the demon were priests of the sect of knowledge. Even with all the priests dead, the demon wouldn't calm down. While reflecting, he finished absorbing the divinity. He had gained another 1,000 units. He stood still facing the beast. He found it curious that demons didn't behave like simple beasts. Meanwhile, the divine hand slowly emerged from his pocket. He warned it that things were about to get intense, and told it to hold on the tattoos. Now a metallic green spread more intensely across his body, visible on his face and arms. Soon the priest's face was reflected in the large, reddish eye of the reptile. He charged forward at high speed, launching himself toward one of the creature's front legs. The beast tried to strike him again with its tail, causing massive destruction. That made the protagonist furious, to the point that the veins on his face and neck bulged. He seemed to be looking for something and found it. The white sword partially embedded in the reptile's head. Without hesitation he ran toward it. He noticed the reptile was tilting again, preparing another attack, but this time he wouldn't let the blow land. Even with its mouth open in a roar, the protagonist did not back down. Placing his hand on the sword's hilt, he thought to himself that the same move wouldn't work on him twice. He was ready to use the beast's own movement against it. The chaos continued. Houses burned, windows shattered, and the scene grew more apocalyptic by the second. The protagonist began to cough in a worrying way. Looking at the palm of his hand, he saw that the blood was becoming more frequent. Worse still, the reptile, now with its back covered in spikes, charged toward him. He repositioned himself. He knew he had to move quickly, as his body was rotting from the inside out. He thought that if the demon kept resisting, the corruption might overflow and escape his body. If that happened, he'd be doomed. Wasting no time, he leaped and grabbed the white sword tightly. He remembered what the priest had said. If he could drive it deep enough into the demon's head to reach the brain, he'd win. Gripping the hilt tightly, he pulled the sword from the creature. When he finished, he smiled. Turning around, he ordered the Lord to awaken. A brilliant light spread out, illuminating the entire area, and Lord Traiaden began to stir in front of astonished eyes. A silhouette could be seen within the light. The great reptile began to disintegrate, and the glow became even more intense. The residents of the nearby districts witnessed the moment. The flash took over much of the city. The light was so bright that even the red-haired girl who was far away, beside Pierre, noticed it. Curious, she walked to the door to confirm what she suspected. When the phenomenon ended, the Lord's body lay on the ground with visible wounds. Smiling, the protagonist asked if he was already awake. The man replied with a slight smirk. As he turned and saw him with his remaining eye, he said he was happy to see him again. The protagonist pointed at the white sword and said, all of that had happened because of it. He raised his hand toward the Lord and said he owed him 2 reserve gold coins. The Lord, looking pleased, seemed to accept the deal with good humor. Leaning on Priest Marnak's hand, he slowly tried to rise after the recent events. Somewhere far away, a mage was focusing power in the palm of her hand. The young woman, with intense blue eyes, appeared to be casting a tracking spell. After carefully manipulating the energy, she launched it in a specific direction. The flow's trajectory indicated the person being tracked had passed through there. And now she and a hooded man watched the result closely. The man, already old and with scars on his face, merely confirmed what he had already suspected. As he stared at the ground, he watched the magic bring forth a strange kind of herb. That sight always stirred old memories in him. He could hardly believe such a powerful authority was involved. But that's exactly what the magic revealed. It was up to him, regretfully, to accept the truth even without finding the bodies. He was sure he had decapitated them. He clearly remembered that day. It was colder than it was now, and although a long time had passed, the memory was still vivid. The young woman beside him agreed with the theory that the bodies could have been taken by monsters or beasts. The old man, looking at her, thanked her for bringing him there, but asked one more favor. She calmly replied that he could ask, as long as he first named the nearby towns, while she quietly observed the surrounding area. Elsewhere, the chaos caused by the demons still spread among the debris. The protagonist and the Lord's butler walked together. When they reached a certain location, the butler opened the door politely for the priest to enter. Marnak stepped in with a calm expression, showing tranquility. The one who seemed even happier to see him was the Lord, who opened his arms in a welcoming gesture. With a gentle smile and closed eyes, the protagonist heard the Lord say, he looked more handsome every time they met. Even so, the Lord admitted he could never express all the gratitude he felt. The priest, with a slight smirk, commented that the demon was alive and breathing, and remembering that the demon himself had said all races deserve to live, he seemed to agree with the thought. After the battle with the great reptile, Word spread that the priest was a demon slayer. Although that title didn't suit him, people started calling him that. The girl from the inn Erin also contributed to this as she quickly became fond of the nickname. Now wherever he went people would comment, "That's the great demon slayer." Others would murmur, "I heard he took on 7 bandits all by himself." Some even said, "Defeating a demon must have been easy for someone like that." This made him avoid certain places. During a conversation with the Lord, Marnak mentioned that he found his wooden prosthetic strange. That was because they moved with surprising naturalness. But the Lord explained he only did that in front of the priest. To others he pretended to limp and claimed he couldn't control them. With a reddish gleam in his eyes, he revealed there was a price to moving them freely. The protagonist, curious, asked what that price was. The man, smiling and sipping his tea, replied that sooner or later, his beautiful hair would fall out. He said he would probably end up like a tree in autumn without leaves. He joked that if they met again in a few months, the priest wouldn't recognize his locks anymore. Marnak pretended to cry, saying that just imagining it already made him sad, and asked to change the subject. The Lord, looking into his teacup, asked if the priest had any free time. He said there was a job, and the requester had specifically asked for Marnak. He mentioned that after the demon slayer, rumors spread, many people became interested in him. When he said the job involved sacred relics from the old empire, the protagonist showed interest. The reward would be 5 gold coins plus an advance payment. If he gave his best, he might even receive one of the discovered relics. These could range from goblets to stones and other objects. Remembered what the mother of corruption had said about relics. Smiling faintly, he thought it would be best to check things out in person. He told the Lord he would accept the job. The protagonist knew that long ago, there had been an empire responsible for ending the era of deranged mages. That empire had unified the continent and developed technologies still in use today. Most items considered high-level nowadays were actually relics from that old empire. Now accompanied by his contractors, Marnak greeted them. A man named Carmen Volts introduced himself, saying he was in charge of the mission. The name sounded familiar, and upon noticing that, Carmen explained he was the son of Anthony Volts. Before the priest could misunderstand, he added that he was an illegitimate son. The priest, smiling, thought to himself that the Black Wolf had always been a man of principles. Even so, he had an illegitimate child. Something surprising, especially after the death of his wife. He wanted to know more but found it inappropriate to ask. Noticing other figures in the background, he asked for them to be introduced. Harmon pointed to the hooded mage and said her name was Tunisha. He then pointed to the burly man, saying he was Sukus from the unicorn tribe. The big guy with huge hands introduced himself politely, saying it was a pleasure to meet the demon slayer. The priest, smiling, asked them to just call him Marnak. Shukas replied that such an accomplishment was nothing to be ashamed of. Carmen, spreading his arms, said that now that everyone was introduced, they could continue the conversation on the road. 2 days later, they were gathered around a campfire. Carmen asked if Marnak wasn't going to sleep. Priest replied that he had already rested enough. Trying to make conversation, the young man asked if he had already found his other half. With slightly flushed cheeks, the protagonist answered that it was like fresh snow covering the field. When asked what kind of person he liked, he thought about the hand of the goddess of corruption. With his eyes closed, he said he preferred someone who would always stay by his side. The goddess, who usually made her presence known, remained silent this time. Carmen commented that the ideal person must have a huge heart. The goddess agreed, seemingly enjoying the direction of the conversation. Then the young man raised his arms and said, smiling, that if the heart was that big, there must be plenty of room to hold him. With a wide grin, he said he liked women with a lot of space between the heart. Protagonist commented that it wasn't bad to have a clear vision of the future, but advised against making such remarks in front of women. Carmen assured him he was only saying that because he saw him as a longtime friend. Marnak's smile in that moment was genuine. He felt the same way. They talked for a long time that night while the goddess watched. Slightly annoyed with his eyes closed, Marnak recalled how the goddess always warned him to be selective with his friends. Even so, when he looked at Carmen, he felt that he was a good person. As they walked through the snow, the mage stopped and announced they had arrived at the place. She raised her hood slightly and stated that from that point on, the responsibility was hers. With the key in hand, She revealed that she was about to open the entrance to the ruin. Entering the ruins of the ancient empire was easy. First they needed to find the key, and then follow the coordinates written on it. In addition, they read the passage, written in ancient language that was engraved on the key itself. To finally insert the key, it had to be turned clockwise or counterclockwise. That was what the mage was doing already, placing the key in the correct slot. She turned it. Only she could do it, since mages were the only ones capable of reading the ancient language, which justified her role in the expedition. However, with a gleam in his eyes, the protagonist knew there was an exception to the rules. The players, they could also read the ancient language. Thus, the protagonist simply kept his abilities hidden. When the portal opened, everyone was ready to enter. The protagonist thought he had kept everything secret. The expedition leader, already with one hand inside the portal, looked back and invited everyone to come in. Once inside, the protagonist carefully observed the portal's interior. That ruin was huge and well preserved, although vegetation had already overtaken the walls. Cayman, as the expedition leader, was thrilled of all the ruins he had visited. That one was perfect. The protagonist, with the same gentle look, said he was certain they would find many artifacts there. After that, he gave a slight smirk. He thought he finally have the chance to see the ruin in person, something he had only seen in photos, which made his heart nearly explode with excitement. But not everyone there was kind or radiated joy. Like the protagonist, the mage was always sulking. With the torches lit, it was easier to identify the path. Just like the others, the unicorn man was very excited. After walking a bit, they reached the great doors where a powerful magic had been inscribed. The magic could only be released if someone among them had imperial blood, which would allow the doors to be opened safely. Looking at the mage, the protagonist heard her warn that they would need imperial blood. She, with a serious expression, said that since none of them were from the empire, once the doors opened, it would be best if everyone was ready for a harsh battle. That's exactly what happened. As soon as she opened the doors, monsters of all kinds came out from within. Those beasts went straight for the group, intending to annihilate them. The serious man, with an axe in hand, was already preparing to defend himself if necessary, and soon he charged toward the monsters to clear the path. Meanwhile, the mage continued casting spells and defending herself. She cast a spell that caused the ground to crack and emit lights through the fissures. After that, several monsters began to fall from the cracks. Large explosions erupted, lighting up much of the area. They then exploded not only the area, but also many of the monsters. Now the protagonist saw them flying through the air. The priest also gripped his sword tightly, ready to react if any of the creatures came close. With an extremely sharp blade and gifted with incredible powers, the priest began to fight as the protagonist in someone highly skilled. He left no monster whole wherever he passed. However, something was bothering him. He had been warned by his goddess about the corruption. A sword was coming his way, but he had enough time to block it. As he turned completely, he saw that it was a monster, and a sword was emerging from the palm of its hand. The player just stared at that monster, thinking he hadn't expected another one, but it was better to eliminate it. With that thought, he prepared himself. But something struck the monster's skull. The priest closed his eyes as an arrow passed very close to him and pierced the monster's skull. He wasn't startled, not even when the arrow passed so close, nor after the monster fell. He simply looked toward the one who had fired the arrow, the leader of that expedition. Still looking back, realizing that the leader had reacted quickly, the protagonist thanked him. Mentally, he heard the unicorn man getting mad at the mage because she was still pushing enemies toward them. The mage, looking in their direction, said it was the fastest way to get rid of all the enemies. She also said they shouldn't complain, since they had managed to eliminate all the monsters. Still, the young man was annoyed. So much so that the once gentle unicorn man was now gritting his teeth, baring his sharp fangs, pouting. He sat with his back turned, veins bulging on his face and his head hanging down. Meanwhile, the protagonist received great praise from the group leader. The priest, who always showed a sweet and gentle appearance, said he was ashamed of having revealed his profane side. Thus the player also returned the compliment to Carmen, saying the young man was very skilled with a bow and arrow. Herman said he had always trained to keep getting better. However, not everyone was cheerful and talking. The mage wanted to know when they would move on. While she said she was ready to go back to exploring like before, the group leader and the protagonist stared at her. She stood still with her staff in hand, saying she still had plenty of mana. The young unicorn man was upset, and didn't even want to hear the girl's voice, so angry that he referred to the mage as a magic mutterer, saying she was being impatient. Upon hearing that she said everyone needed to rest a bit more, and that she believed the others agreed with her, she went on to provoke Sukus, saying that, to be honest, she thought he was just trying to put on a show. However, the final word belonged to the expedition leader, and he sided with the unicorn man Sukus even with the mage. Carmen declared that the matter was settled. They would rest, and he didn't want to hear another word about it. Putting on a cheerful face, the protagonist thought all mages were full of themselves. In that world, becoming a mage was easy. It happened at birth if one was born with the ability, even with some variations. Those born with mana awakened it at a certain age, and were then able to access their magic. When that happened, knowledge of the ancient language would flow into their minds. Thus they gained power without having to pay for it. They learned the ancient tongue and were given a magic staff. They could tap into the mana that flowed through their veins, which allowed them to break the world's natural laws. The protagonist, looking at the mage, knew that since they were born mages, they had everything due to their vast knowledge. Most of them rejected any other way of learning new things, and just like the old mages, most became dull-minded, stubborn, rude and grumpy. Protagonist, watching how she treated Sukus, thought most mages were arrogant. To be honest, he felt that among all the mages, she was actually quite polite. Despite her bad temper, she spoke little and her criticisms weren't that harsh. After some rest, the expedition leader announced it was time to move out. He said they would explore the next area, and everyone was already on their feet and ready. It was at that moment that they all heard a loud noise, like a massive roar. That heavy sound seemed to come from a corridor. Dust and a powerful gust of wind hit the 4 members of the group. That's when the expedition leader noticed that the doors behind them had closed. As he said this, the other 3 looked in the direction he pointed. But that wasn't all. A huge monster fell from the ceiling. It was a massive creature made of silver, with something glowing on its head that emitted a blue hue. That orb on its head appeared to be the core that sustained its whole body. Looking at the creature, the protagonist smiled, thrilled. He couldn't believe it was real. He had assumed the enemies in that ruin were too weak, but now seeing that silver monster, he was sure that was the real threat. Sukus watched the immense monster before him, trying to maintain a firm stance, though the sweat on his forehead betrayed his fear. Despite being ready to fight, the unicorn man was caught off guard. When the mage ordered him to fall back immediately, the woman stepped in front of everyone and with steady movements, channeled her magical energy to the tip of her staff. Murmuring an ancient incantation, she cast her spell at the imposing silver monster that threatened the group. The mage's intention was clear: to bring down the chamber ceiling on the creature, crushing it under the weight of the rocks and ending the fight decisively. However, to everyone's surprise, absolutely nothing happened to that colossal being. From a distance, the mission leader frowned, as he realized the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He shouted as loud as he could, trying to warn to Ninja that the attack was too risky, and that her magic, unfortunately, wouldn't be enough. It was too late. On the monster's forehead, an intense blue light began to shine brightly, signaling the release of a devastating power. In an instant, the monster activated its ability, and crushed all the rocks hurled at it, reducing them to dust and tiny fragments. Upon witnessing the magnitude of that power, the 3 frontline members froze in fear. Soon after, burning chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling, threatening to engulf Tanisha. Seeing the desperation on her companions' faces, she looked up and realized this would be her end. The monster was already closing in fast and took the stance of someone about to deliver a fatal blow. When it struck with its fist toward the mage, there was nothing left of her to be remembered. Even the unicorn man, who rarely showed any sympathy for Tanisha, was overcome with deep sorrow. The impact of the loss was so great that Sukus became completely motionless, turning into a vulnerable target. The protagonist, witnessing the scene, shouted desperately for Sukus to duck or get out of the creature's line of sight. Unfortunately, the young man couldn't hear the warnings or react. In time, the monster's blow hit him directly, and a massive explosion lit up the area. Thus, the unicorn man was struck head-on, with no chance to flee or defend himself. Now the Silver Colossus, with the blue core, turned its attention to the last two survivors of the expedition. With a gaze that made its intentions clear, the priest turned to the expedition leader and asked if he truly wanted to stay alive. Upon hearing the affirmative answer, the protagonist clenched his fist and firmly gave the man the chance to swallow his words. The leader, confused by the priest's attitude, didn't understand what was about to happen until he was suddenly knocked out. The priest held his unconscious companion in his arms, but didn't take his eyes off the monster. He had already said that he had a powerful ally, and so he summoned the beast. The metallic being didn't understand what this new creature appearing before it was. The beast emerged with its fingers interlaced, ready to unleash a devastating strike. It struck the enemy from above with a crushing blow, making it clear that it wasn't there to play. The protagonist, with his friend slung over his shoulder, began to withdraw from the battlefield, trusting the giant to handle the rest. Looking back, he felt secure for having summoned that creature, a reliable entity in moments of greatest despair. While fleeing, he found the remains of the mage and absorbed 1,000 units of divinity. Without wasting time, he also gathered what was left of the Unicorn Man, obtaining another 100 units. After that, he leaned Carmen, still unconscious, against a secure wall with a hand on his head. Unsure of what to do, the young man reflected on the battle. He believed it would take time before the beast could fully defeat the enemy. At that moment, the hand of the goddess of corruption began to stir restlessly inside his pocket. With a serious expression, the protagonist remarked to it that everything was happening just as it had predicted. Unleashing his neon green tattoos, he decided he could no longer hesitate. He rushed back toward the battlefield, ready to help. His eyes were fixed on the blue core in the center of the metallic creature's head. His true objective, the jewel, shimmered with a supernatural intensity. As the fight between monsters continued, the priest knew that gem was the only truly distinct part of that metallic body. He concluded that destroying it would be the key to ending the threat. So he climbed onto the back of the allied beast and launched himself into the air, determined to reach the glowing core. As he approached, he noticed that the jewel reflected his movements precisely. Without hesitation, he struck with force, shattering the core into multiple fragments. His eyes still glowed green as he fell onto the ground, already ravaged by battle. With the core destroyed, the metallic monster remained paralyzed for a brief moment. Before collapsing, the beast, sent by the goddess of corruption, lifted its head and howled as if celebrating victory. The protagonist silently thanked the creature for its help. At that moment, the hand of the goddess pointed in a specific direction. The young man followed the gesture with his gaze and, suspicious, asked what had happened. That was when 3 more giant, metallic monsters dropped from the ceiling. The protagonist's expression changed, revealing an unusual look. Now the new enemies stared directly at the beast and the priest. It was clear that neither of them was in any condition to face 3 more opponents of the same level. With a grim expression, the protagonist wondered how many more of them would appear. Leaving the battlefield behind, he returned to the expedition leader. The man, waking up, asked about the whereabouts of their companions. With sorrow, the protagonist informed him that, unfortunately, they hadn't even had the chance to defend themselves. Carmen reflected on the moment when the giants fell from the ceiling, and concluded the key should have been activated earlier. Noticing that the man was blaming himself, the priest reminded him that everyone had been hired for a reason. Recalling the Unicorn Man and the mage, he said both of them knew exactly the risk they were taking. The leader, intrigued, wanted to know what place exactly that was. The priest answered seriously. They were standing before the legendary Black Gate. The man widened his eyes, incredulous at the revelation. It seemed impossible, and he closed his eyes tightly, trying to process the information. Even without understanding how it could have happened, he decided not to ask questions. Instead, he swore in the name of the Volts that he would repay the debt he owed the priest. Smiling with his usual serene face, the priest replied that he would be waiting eagerly. Now standing in the corridor, he suggested that if his companion was feeling better, the two of them should keep moving, as the monsters hadn't been completely defeated. He knew that, after taking down a single giant, with the help of the beast of corruption, others had descended from the ceiling, forcing him to retreat nearly out of strength. He had barely managed to open the doors ahead needing to kick Carmen to push him into the room before moving on. He told the beast of corruption to return as soon as possible, as he knew she would come back shortly. As he walked, he observed the stones along the path, studying the composition of the soil. He looked up, amazed by what appeared to be valuable archaeological findings. Standing before a new door, he declared that they had finally reached the end of the ruins. The priest, turning to his companion, said he was free to explore the place however he wished. And when they carefully opened the door and entered, they saw two relics displayed atop a pedestal, bathed in light from afar. The young man now understood that the stories he had read in books were true. Turning to the protagonist, he told the priest he knew he had no right to ask, but he still wished to request a favor. He asked, a bit hesitant, if he could keep that necklace, promising he would repay them generously. With his usual smile, the priest asked what exactly that necklace was. Carmen explained that the object was known as the lineage pathfinder, and revealed that with just a single drop of blood, it would be able to use the wearer's blood like a needle, pointing in the direction of someone from the same bloodline. Protagonist closing his eyes for a brief moment. Figure he already knew what the boy was hoping for. With a satisfied expression, the expedition leader declared that, while it may have been obvious he was searching for his mother, the protagonist listened silently, as the young man spoke of seeking a mother he had never known. Then the boy turned to the priest, awaiting confirmation that he could indeed keep the necklace. The priest replied that it was fine, and asked in return if he could keep the sword. After leaving that sacred place, they lit a campfire and sat around it, both of them avoiding contact with large blocks of metal. Still remembering the recent ordeal they had faced, as he put on the necklace, Carmen commented that if it hadn't been for the priest, the two of them would surely be lost. While he discreetly looked at the protagonist, that priest seemed lost in deep thought, holding the necklace in his hands. The young man asked the priest if he could bless it. The protagonist, with a serene smile, said yes, that he would be happy to bless it. With a light touch on the boy's finger, he made a small puncture. The boy closed his eyes, and soon after a drop of blood appeared. He gave thanks, as the priest said that the goddess of preservation would protect him. The boy then placed the drop inside the necklace, letting it serve as the pulse point. He watched closely, as the drop fell onto the small plate at the center of the necklace. As soon as it happened, it seemed that magic flowed through the entire object, spreading outward. Baltus was visibly pleased, as when he looked at the plate, he noticed that now the necklace resembled a compass, whose needle pointed directly toward the direction of his mother. He was certain she was alive. The protagonist expressed his joy in seeing that the necklace worked. As promised, Carmen Valtis declared that it was all thanks to the priest, and admitted he didn't even know how he would repay such a debt. Looking into the priest's eyes, he revealed that he wished to ask for one more favor. That statement caught the protagonist's attention. He began observing his friend in silence, waiting for the new request. Valtis revealed that since the two of them were heading west, he hoped the priest would join them in the search for his mother. He believed they could visit the capital, where he could then reward him properly for his support on the journey. Protagonist listened attentively, as the young man assured him that he would cover the cost of the trip, and smiled deep down. The priest wanted to accept, but he knew he couldn't stay near the same person for too long. As he looked at the young man's face lit with hope, he saw that he was waiting for an affirmative answer. However, sitting by the fire, he still remained silent, which made Volta slightly uncomfortable. The priest smiled subtly. He felt that he could speak to his friend without sounding insincere. Then he stood up, took the young man's hand, and said that if it was all right with him, he would help in the search for his mother. Smiling, the protagonist seemed to radiate light, and declared that he would do his best to support the young ones on their journey. A long time passed at the end, and the redhead thought it was absurd that the priest was leaving. Just like that, she was furious, as the protagonist had only gone to fetch his belongings, and was now saying goodbye. Aaron then asked him to give her his hand for a moment. He said that it normally wouldn't be ready so quickly, but he had done his best to finish it. When the protagonist looked at what he was holding, his eyes narrowed. It was the silver mercenary plate. She wanted him to say something meaningful, and hoped he would understand what he was supposed to say. But he didn't get it and simply thanked her, which made her even more annoyed. What he should have said was that they would soon be serving together. She told him those words, finishing with a teasing wink. He understood. He closed his eyes and slightly lowered his head, as he wasn't used to returning to the same places. Since he lived a wandering life, he preferred not to retrace his steps as it could limit his freedom. Aaron remarked to Priest Marnak that if he kept living that way, he would never find his soulmate. She said that was why it was up to her to say what needed to be said. He looked at her, hoping to understand better what she meant. Her words were that she would see him again soon. Now that truly confused him. Aaron repeated that they would meet again and very soon. Before he could say anything, she placed her fingers over his lips and said, he didn't need to know how. With one final gesture, she placed her finger over her own lips and said that would be her last act before delivering a punishment elsewhere. Overdue had gone to visit the Lord and was surprised to see his shiny, bald head smiling. The Lord said he had merely reached the true form of human nature, but he quickly changed the subject and asked if the priest was heading to the capital. He then handed him a letter of recommendation. Smiling enigmatically, he admitted he couldn't pay him at the moment, but that letter could help him get out of a tight spot, as he had a trusted friend there. He warned, however, that he should only seek that friend as a last resort, as he was difficult to deal with. The priest thanked him sincerely for the gift. Meanwhile, the Lord expressed his happiness in being able to offer, as a gesture of true friendship. He wished the young man a wonderful life, knowing how short life could be. In another region, several footprints were seen in the snow. Two friends walked side by side, moving away from GIS smiling. Valtus remarked that they still had about half a day of walking before reaching the next town. The protagonist seemed cheerful, but he knew the mother of corruption still didn't like Carmel Valtus. The only reason she allowed them to travel together was that he was a new ally among the 3 and a 2 fingers. That alliance could generate 10,000 divinity points, the equivalent of a high authority. Still, he preferred to keep him. The priest walked, watching his cheerful friend ahead, thinking he liked his vibrant personality. While reflecting, he sensed a different energy in the air, so he drew his sword, a peculiar blade with multiple serrations, and called his companion's attention. Volts, upon seeing the priest with sword in hand, smiled nervously, especially after hearing him say with a grim look. The priest stated that it was close, and positioned the sword in front of his body. He knew something was following them and was getting closer fast. Upon hearing this, Carmen turned sharply. Something really was approaching, and the young man leaped aside, dodging an imminent strike. They were startled to see a massive spider covering much of the sky. As it drew near, the monstrous creature landed very close to them, entangled in the branches of a tree. As Carmen asked the protagonist what kind of animal it was, approaching it, he confirmed that it was a snow spider. The now revealed monster was looking for an opening to begin its attack. Seeing this, the young man got ready, drawing his bow and arrows. Harmum, looking up, saw that the protagonist already had his sword in hand, striking the enemy in the next moment. After defeating one of them, more spiders appeared, and he once again stepped forward. With a wild grin, he said to the hand of the goddess that next time he planned to use that sword, he need to find a place to clean it first, saying this while raising it once more. In the next blow, he struck another advancing spider, further soiling his blade. Not just the sword, but his entire body was now covered in remains of the creatures. Changing scenes. The destruction in the city of GIS was shown in an improvised location. The lord of that region was receiving an unexpected visitor. The guest, a young woman with blue hair, said that he didn't need to worry. Being direct, he asked what the reason for the surprise visit was, since it was rare for the flame of the blue acceptance to appear without warning. She placed a paper on the table and asked him to take a look. While the lord looked at the paper, she asked if he had ever seen that man before. He, holding the paper, saw a rather poorly drawn sketch, but still recognized the priest. Trying to hide his familiarity with the image, he asked why they were looking for that person. Through the window, the morning sun dominated the view, and the woman said it was a personal matter. She heard the lord say that no one could identify someone based on that drawing alone. He then said that if that was all, he would suggest she return, as he had no time to waste amid the chaos. The young woman seemed to understand, and with that she stood up and left, while the lord simply watched her go. After realizing she had left, He stroked his beard and began thinking about the priest. Meanwhile, Volts was searching for something inside the spiders, and the priest simply watched that strange act. Smiling as usual, he asked the boy what he was doing. He heard the young man say he was looking for the venom sac from the snow spider, which also piqued his curiosity. Now holding the venom container, the boy said it could be sold for a high price. Still smiling, the priest asked how he knew so much. Harmon told the priest that he had taken part in several monster hunts, and had learned a lot through experience. While cutting the parts he needed, he said it was all learned through practice, which he considered very useful. Trying to back away to avoid getting sprayed, the priest said he would try it as well. His companion, covered in grime, said it was about half a day's distance to the nearest city. Elsewhere, the guards were on alert as they spotted something up ahead, and one pointed it out to the other. It was true, they were signaling that two people were approaching, and those people were the protagonist and his companion. One of the guards trying to help Bran until he caught up with the two. Looking somewhat alarmed, he asked how they had managed to get past the city blockade. The protagonist, wearing a confused expression, said they had walked the entire way there. The guard understood, but said the city had been blocked off for at least 3 days, due to the monsters that seemed to interest the priest. So the protagonist asked the guard to explain more about it. The guard revealed that monster attacks had been becoming more frequent lately. Volts heard the guard say that after the attacks, there were no traces of bodies left behind, which was strange. Everyone knew that snow spiders were monsters that only consume the blood of their prey. Now the guards watched the two men and called for their attention. One of them said that the local lord was asking to see them, and another, panting, confirmed the information. The last guard to arrive said he would accompany them to where the lord was. To the protagonist, it was interesting to learn that the property belonged to a lord. After a while, all of them had bathed and were now standing before a chubby lord. The protagonist said he was already aware of the monster situation. The lord stated that this was the reason he had summoned them, to discuss the current events. He said it was all being orchestrated by a worshipper of an evil spirit, but the protagonist thought blocking the entire city was overkill for just one cultist. The lord explained that according to priests, there were at least 4 different cults, in front of a table full of various dishes. The lord explained that these cults were working together. He even teared up as he shared that he had only recently become lord, and that, if his father were still alive, he would have resolved the situation. While displaying the many types of food, he thought at least there were still plenty of supplies. The soldiers also still had some morale, so things weren't too bad at the table. Spreading his arms, he said that no one knew what was really happening, as the city was isolated. Looking at the protagonist, the lord said he needed someone who could get past the monsters. The lord's expression was full of concern, waiting for their response, especially from the priest. Still silent, the priest closed his eyes as if focusing on something. Then he said that he would help to the best of his ability. Sometime later, he was having a conversation with the hand of the goddess, who was furious with the magical item in hand. He said that at least they had received it from the investigators of the flow. Using the magical item, he said it could only be found in desert regions. Now the protagonist was sitting on the edge of the bed, alongside the hand of the goddess, his sword and the enchanted container. He placed the sword inside the magic vessel, just as the goddess had instructed, to improve the blade's sharpness. After finishing, he picked up the valuable item and was about to store it away, while the hand of the goddess touched his shoulders, rubbing one hand against the other. She said that life was meant to be lived to the fullest. Looking at the item in his inventory, the protagonist seemed satisfied, and the hand of the goddess remained with him with a crooked smile. He said he had always wanted to say those words. He told the goddess that the real reason he accepted the lord's request was how strange the situation felt. He had never heard of 4 different sects cooperating, even though the title of evil spirit sounded intimidating. In that game it didn't mean much. Everyone knew it was a title given by the main gods to other gods. Among all evil spirit worshippers, it was rare to find one mentally stable. Unlike the sects under the main god, cooperated to combat the evil spirit, the sects that served the spirit rarely acted together. That's why the protagonist, with a cold and suspicious look, believed something strange was going on. With that feeling he rode out along with the Lord's guard soldiers. Carmen looked back and noticed something strange, starting to feel worried when she looked up. Her mouth fell open in awe, for there were several monstrous spiders. The priest simply seemed pleased, believing that the time had come. Voltus was startled when the protagonist announced he would ride ahead, to draw their attention even after hearing from his friend that it was far too dangerous to handle them all alone. The protagonist warned that if they kept going at that pace, they would be caught quickly. Voltus didn't quite understand what he meant, but his eyes remained wide, letting go of the reins. The protagonist told Carmen to fetch reinforcements and to make sure she brought them while the others galloped ahead. The protagonist, having dropped the reins, was now falling. When his companion saw that Priest Marna had stayed behind, he simply shouted quite pleased. The protagonist told the hand of the goddess that his line had been very impactful. Then a massive explosion sent snow and ice flying in all directions. Hearing it, Voltas gripped the reins tightly and closed his eyes with a sad expression. With the explosion, the other riders looked back. When they did, they saw massive beasts like large mutated wolves. There were also snow spiders in greater numbers, along with snakes and centipedes. But among all those monsters, the most monstrous of all was the protagonist. With a crazy smile, he asked the goddess what she meant when she said his performance was interesting. With his sword in hand, he was ready to saw through all those monstrosities. He was willing to give proper attention to every single one of those little monsters, and for that he had his saw. While he fought off some monsters, even more kept appearing, but the protagonist pressed on, slashing with his sword at all who crossed his path. He gripped the hilt of that unique sword tightly. With it, he delivered fatal blows to every monster that stood before him, and more snow spiders appeared, along with other terrifying monsters. But after striking down all those beasts with his two swords, he turned his back and let them fall with a satisfied expression. He thought that if this happened every day, he should start carrying a bathtub. He thought he should mention it later, for now he stood before a strange place. He walked thinking he couldn't believe the treatment he was receiving. That place had old wheels and barrels. He looked around and thought. He remembered mentioning that the attack carriages had been empty. Walking among them, he noticed a hand near his feet. Bending down to take a closer look, he saw the rest of the body completely dried out. A typical attack from spiders that drained all the blood from a body. Looking up, he couldn't understand why they were enjoying such a good meal. Now he could see they had left the remains as decoration. Personally, he thought it was quite the extravagant decoration. With a light-hearted tone, he told the goddess not to worry, but asked her to keep their guard protected at all times. As he walked, he told her that when it came to humans, he figured that thing could probably eat them. Looking around, he thought there were enough bodies for them to feast on. For 3 days he figured they were raising hatchlings. Still walking with that question on his mind, he saw Antonio up ahead, and he was big. He noticed that from that point on, everything got much larger, as if several giants lived in that region. That made him smile. He figured the divinity that was always trailing behind him should finally show itself. With that, several eyes opened in his direction, and when he looked up he saw of a giant spider, even larger than all the others. That one wasn't alone, she seemed to be their queen, the largest of them all, and there were several others. She looked ready to start a fight with the protagonist. At that moment his eyes turned a deeper green, and he asked the goddess to draw the line of corruption. Immediately, a line of green energy began forming around all the spiders. Still with the green light reflecting on the young man's face, he just smiled subtly, unintimidated, standing face to face with that massive spider. He told the goddess that he would need her authority. When he said that, the beast began to appear to help him as always, and he confessed that today he would sacrifice himself. Now came the fierce white beast, always attentive to the priest's calls. He told the great beast he would offer her the head of that human-eating spider. He watched the white beast fight the giant spider, and with that green tattoo-like marks reappeared on his face. He also noticed the beast was at a disadvantage, as the spider was stabbing its tentacles into her. That arachnid monster growled and bared its razor-sharp fangs at the beast. The beast roared in pain as all those tentacles pierced into her, and the protagonist noticed the spider was twice the size, and it was extremely furious, still growing and baring its teeth, even drooling with a sly look. The protagonist thought he needed to find a way to help the giant, so he started slicing with his special swords, cutting those tentacles and preventing them from attacking the giant. He wanted to free him so he could help more. I could feel that the energy was concentrated inside the spider's body, and he kept cutting, making sure not to damage any part of the spider. Looking with intensely green eyes, he thought there had to be a weaker point somewhere. Looking up from below the spider, he noticed the weak point was now visible. He decided to strike near it, almost splitting the spider in half. Even with all that liquid splattered on his face, he was satisfied now because he understood. He positioned his body for the next attack, and noticed the divinity was spread throughout the body. He leaped again to face the spider, intending to cut only the legs to avoid damaging the divinity. While the monster was still fighting, the protagonist told it to run ahead. Holding on tightly to something, he said he would help, and asked the great beast to make sure the spider wouldn't move. With that, the white beast opened its mouth wide and began growling louder. She grabbed the spider's legs to stop it from moving, just as the protagonist had asked. The arachnid found the sudden movements of the two strange. While the massive beast held the arachnid, the protagonist ran at a perfect angle to strike the ideal spot. He thought that even though it was different, it was still a spider, so he would only cut the skeletal part of its torso. He charged at the weak point and severed the thinnest skeletal section of the body, preserving the rest as he did this. His gaze intensified in a deep green and extreme malice. Using a powerful strike, he got the reaction he needed. As it was being split, the spider looked at him with confusion. The protagonist had to strike several times, as that part was very dense and difficult to cut. While the beast still held it, he continued attacking the same spot, until finally the result he was expecting came. That piece fell apart. Now he had managed to split the spider the right way. He leaped back in front of the light created by the blow. When the parts separated, the white beast, summoned by the mother of corruption, growled so hard that it showed all its teeth. While the protagonist, having struck the ideal spot, landed on the ground, the beast made sure that the severed part didn't fall on him, and still held firmly. Its large hands gripped the spider's tentacles, and then she threw the unnecessary piece far away from the protagonist. After everything, the protagonist landed safely, placing one arm on the ground to balance himself. He was a bit startled as he had landed right under the massive beast, who was growling and still seemed to hold a grudge. The protagonist knew he had let the beast down the other day, so he apologized for having run away. The wild beast growled, opening her mouth wide and raising her arms. Looking sideways, the protagonist thought the beast still wasn't calm enough. She was still upset, but also upset was the divinity that had been forced to leave the spider's body. She emerged from the destroyed spider's mouth, and could only see the protagonist's legs. He, satisfied, pointed to himself and said he knew he was a strange person. That person was very peculiar, with red eyes and several black dots where eyebrows should be. She came out of the spider's mouth as if being spit out, clearly frustrated that her plans had been ruined. She looked at the smiling protagonist, who asked her why she had surrounded that city. That beast-like woman asked him why she should tell him anything against her will. While the remains of the giant spider and several others lay on the ground, the protagonist was seen poking at his sword, looking down from above. He told her it was better to explain why she was surrounding the city. The more that figure refused to speak, the deeper he drove the sword into her arm. That deity even began to drool, yet kept smiling as if not even pain would make her talk. She herself said that not even in death would she reveal something she didn't want to. Smiling, the protagonist said he had already figured that out, and from the panicked look in the deity's eyes, it was obvious what would happen next. With no other option, the protagonist simply separated the deity's head from her body. Now, after that blow, his sword glowed amid the surrounding filth. Upon harvesting that deity, he gained an extra 1,000 in his rewards. He wondered how many more of them needed to be defeated before those evil spirit worshippers would say something. Smirking, he figured he had already done what needed to be done there. A somewhat devilish grin wrapped in green energy. He smiled and said he could eliminate as many as needed. After the protagonist dealt with that deity, he returned looking down. He saw the blazing flames and his expression hardened. He couldn't understand how they had already found and set that city on fire. Inside the gates, while the lord remained collapsed with tears in his eyes. The people around him stared at his large body, commenting that although he was considered a lord, he looked like a pig. Now they were discussing a reincarnation, and the blonde man wanted to know the condition of the black-haired woman, who was described as unstable. Another lady blonde with curly hair said things weren't ready yet. She believed they might have lost some rats because of someone, and as she said that, she looked toward the young black-haired woman with her hand raised. She expressed her full indignation, claiming that none of what she had done was intentional. She spoke of the two muscular monks, and that man from the teaching sect who wouldn't stop bothering her. Now, the three of them were arguing near the flames and the Lord's body about what they intended to do. They also mentioned the archer who had managed to escape, commenting about Carmen who had dashed off on his horse. The woman with curls, green eyes, and an eye patch noticed the absence of the spider's member. They still didn't know she had been destroyed. The blonde man with blue eyes believed it was already too much, and that there was no reason for them to fight among themselves, since that bastard had escaped, and they were worried about the need to pursue Carmen. It was far too risky to let that young man get away, as they had spent many years investigating a perfect plan. The black-haired woman was extremely furious, shouting with veins bulging. Seeing her desperation, the blonde woman realized the blonde man wasn't paying her enough attention. She knew that the man and the other black-haired woman were getting closer with setting everything aside. She announced she would go check how things were outside. The blonde man, seeing the scene Parma was causing, asked her to calm down when he declared he would punish Layla, the spider woman, for the whole mess. Parma, with a smile on her face and a hand on her hip, said that if that were the case, she'd stay quiet for now. But her eyes widened when she saw what was happening before her. The blonde woman's head simply flew off her body. It was the priest. He appeared with his unconventional sword, and was already making heads roll. The man, upon seeing the sword with serrated edges on both sides, showed fear. Moments later, the protagonist sliced the blonde man with blue eyes in half, literally. Meanwhile, Parma, the young woman with black hair and violet eyes, clenched her teeth in fear. Protagonist wore a terrifying expression as if he were rotting away, and it showed on his face. He thought that killing the third member of that group without saying anything might be a bit unfair. So, with his face returning to normal and a wide grin, he remarked that those people were capable of manipulating deities. The woman, eyes wide with fear, feared for her life but was willing to tell everything. To that, the protagonist was even surprised, since he didn't need to intimidate her. She revealed everything herself. When she finished, her eyes remained wide and she was sweating, afraid that she wouldn't be released. The protagonist, now calmer and with a faint smile on his lips, still surrounded by green essence, kept staring at the young woman and said she was a worshipper of the evil spirit. Then, smiling, he asked the reason they were surrounding that city. After hearing the story, he found it all more interesting than he had imagined. She pointed to a giant head that looked like a living meatball, explaining that was the reason they had taken so much time. Pointing upward, she said everything had been perfect, because they had spent 3 years preparing for it. That thing seemed alive and quickly rooted itself into the ground. The story was simple, and the woman said they would have to sacrifice everyone inside the city. In truth, she claimed, the group knew they would need at least 5 years to prepare, but with the disappearance of one of the knights, they had to push the plan ahead. Upon hearing all that, the protagonist grabbed a saw and got ready to cut. Parma feared she would be the victim, but he walked past her, saying he would eliminate that monster that had consumed human flesh and blood. The woman pleaded, while he tore through the meat mass with his unusual sword. She warned that it couldn't be done, that the dignity wasn't complete yet. But the protagonist ignored her. Desperate, she screamed that everyone was in danger. Even so, calmly, the protagonist was pierced by the creature that emerged. From the meat mass, the monster awakened, unstable, opened a mouth full of teeth and rose from that strange blob. It screamed that it was in pain. Then a massive eye appeared, taking up most of its body. And from inside the meat mass emerged a divinity screaming in fury. Protagonist simply raised his hand to remove the tentacle, launched at his arm after pulling it off and slicing it with his sword. He wore a wicked grin, throwing the tentacle to the ground. He stepped on it, and said he would sacrifice that ball of meat to his goddess. Meanwhile, Parma screamed, not quite understanding what the priest was doing. She desperately said She didn't know what might happen if he kept provoking that creature, but rolling her eyes, she accepted that this was punishment coming from the protagonist's hand. As soon as he eliminated the creature, Parma gained another 1,000 divinity points. Now her total divinity was 8,592. Just like the worshippers of the evil spirit, he had also extracted the Lord's divinity. Since the man was still lying on the ground, it was easy to collect his divinity. He knew that all he needed to gain a new authority was 10,000 units. Meanwhile, the large-eyed monster salivated while looking at the protagonist. The priest thought that, if he tried to cut that meat blob with the slayer, the monster would regenerate. On the other hand, he kept fighting. He would end up defeated. He knew that strange being wasn't like the Spider Queen, who had a weak point while he thought. The creature, full of tentacles and with a gigantic eye, fully emerged from the meat mass. Aware that he had no other choice, he gripped his sword tightly. He positioned his feet to run and then he burst forward, running as fast as he could, leaving the monster confused. Seeing the protagonist flee, the massive red eye widened, and the creature screamed that it was in pain. Protagonist simply approached the fallen citizens to collect their divinities. Each one represented a divinity. Since they weren't authorities or anything similar, he passed by each of them, accumulating points, but it still wasn't enough. While the monster chased him, the priest smiled. He spoke to his goddess, who already knew, it seemed. She was telling him he should gain a new authority. Before facing the monster kept running, its large eye glowing as it roared with its mouth open. Within its field of vision was the protagonist, who from the monster's perception, appeared in black and white. The monster was already close, and when it stopped to scream, the ground cracked violently. At one point the protagonist had to stop and cover his ears, as even the monster's voice was overwhelming. That walking disaster hurled its tentacles in the priest's direction. He looked back, already moving to grab his sword. As the tentacles flew, the monster shattered much of the ground and the surroundings, but they landed very close to the protagonist, who leaped backward and shouted for the goddess. While that huge monster screamed it was in pain, a massive hole opened above its head. From the enormous opening, the monster saw shrinking in its eyes the descent of the goddess's monster. The white giant brought its hands together for a devastating blow. It was the signature move of the white giant, sent by the goddess, who struck the monster from above. A massive explosion of greenish dust could be seen from afar. Clenching his teeth, the protagonist already knew that one strike wouldn't be enough, but it had left the monster even more furious. Now that beast was gnashing its teeth at the great white giant. Even so, it also plunged its tentacles into the giant's body. Seeing that scene, the protagonist grew enraged. Watching the corruption giant being impaled, the protagonist knew the giant alone wouldn't be enough, but he asked the monster to do its best. Now the priest was thinking of a way to gather more dignity, and thus authority to do that. He would need more victims left behind by the fire, and the worshippers of the evil spirit. Since that was the case, he ran through the flames. But many of those bodies had already lost their divinities. The fire had covered most of the area, and the goddess warned the priest that most of them were no longer useful. Protagonist, had he known, would have harvested the divinities before confronting the trio of evil spirit worshippers. As he ran, he thought about how the number of accumulated units so far was only 9,237. Stepping firmly through the blaze, he thought he just needed a little more. He focused on his thoughts while running through the flames. At a certain moment, something curious caught his attention. A large explosion occurred very close to him. It was so strong that he had to raise both arms to avoid being hit by the debris. With his special sword in hand, he looked to defend himself. Meanwhile, the monster tried to hurl its tentacles toward the protagonist. Thanks to his skill, he managed to stop some of the tentacles with his saw. He preferred to run and collect more units, rather than engage in a doomed fight. While that sticky monster screamed the only word it seemed to know, cried out that it hurt. Now it was above the protagonist, trying to strike by surprise. Although it attacked, it wasn't successful, as the protagonist simply dodged. The monster, already highly evolved, ground its teeth in hatred and rage. Meanwhile, the protagonist, with his green eyes and saw in hand, stared the monster down. Now that tentacled beast had feet that were nearly human. Its appearance was also much closer to that of a human. It no longer had tentacles. The protagonist, now face to face with that monster, noticed it had undergone a significant change. After fighting the giant, that monster, with only one eye and clenched teeth, opened its hand toward the protagonist. The monster appeared to be smirking slightly as it watched the protagonist from afar. After opening its hand, several tentacles emerged and were launched toward the priest. Priest looked at the creature before him with focused eyes. Thanks to his attentiveness, he was able to slice through the incoming tentacles from multiple directions, all with his sword, which looked more like a saw. Of course, the monster didn't like having its tentacles shredded. The protagonist wasn't going to stop there. He lunged toward the monster, intending to slice it too. As he prepared this attack, his green eyes intensified. Noticing something different, the monster had closed the distance too fast and was already in an attacking stance. It managed to grab the protagonist with several of its tentacles. The monster appeared to be exerting force, trying to hold the protagonist tightly. It also ran, seemingly trying to slam the protagonist into the ground. The priest, now upside down, noticed the ground drawing nearer and nearer until he was thrown with full force into the earth. Upon impact, he cracked the surface, lying there with his arms spread. He looked up with a mocking smile. He told his goddess that he was fine, and actually considered himself really lucky. Then, he asked the goddess if she remembered what the worshippers had said. Earlier he reminded her that they had said, the large man lying on the ground was a lord. Placing his sword on the ground for support, he stood up. He seemed to struggle a bit to stay upright. As he rose, foot of the enemy watching him came into view. Not only was it watching, but it was already preparing a new attack. Move from a distance. The priest noticed the glow radiating from the beast he had been seeking. Realizing his time was short, still smiling, the priest asked the goddess to harvest all the divinities. After saying that, green flames engulfed the place. It became clear that his divinity was increasing rapidly, especially since that was a concentration of soldiers. As soon as his divinity reached 10,000, the protagonist already wore a different expression. While the monster stared at him, it wondered what he was doing, when the priest simply stopped. Within a core of green essence, it began to radiate, and the monster just watched. The priest asked the goddess to accept his offering of 10,000 units. The divinity appeared behind the protagonist as a beautiful woman, wrapped in shadow. The monster, seeing this, didn't seem to like the green light and didn't know what was happening. Now around the protagonist, black flames surrounded him from all sides, which caused even more confusion and astonishment in the monster, who could only watch at a certain point. It noticed that the protagonist was walking toward it, with the expression of someone ready to fight. The protagonist had a calm gaze, and seemed to have something very interesting in store for the monster in front of him. The priest's sword already had its saw blades properly set in place. Protagonist closed his eyes, excited. As he said, the monster was about to feel an immense level of pain. With that, the beast widened its red eye and gnashed its teeth. The protagonist, now with his usual neon green tattoos, asked the beast to watch closely. But of course the monster wouldn't just stand still. It was already preparing a new attack. Yet before the demonic eyes of the protagonist, before his new authority, the pit of corruption, that monster was nothing and wouldn't get what it wanted so easily. As he passed near the monster, the protagonist knew his powers could decompose any living being. He was satisfied, for he had managed to use the scripture of corruption, while the monster simply smiled. Using the corruption rosary had paid off. Now he could choose which part of the body would decompose. The monster was shocked when it noticed its hand was deteriorating, to the point of falling off. Looking at it with sarcasm, the priest wanted to know how good the monster's regeneration was. The monster, eyes wide, couldn't tell whether it was gaining decomposition or regeneration. Even so, the protagonist wouldn't wait. He had his sword and would saw the monster apart. The weakened monster, with its red eye frozen, begged the protagonist to stop. But for that rival it was already too late. The priest's sword had already pierced through what remained of its body. As he split what was left of the monster in half, the priest told his goddess, satisfied that he had succeeded. Now the priest held a sphere surrounded by pink energy, and the hand of the goddess also held it. That glowing sphere was a relic, the protagonist had chosen to offer to the goddess. As the goddess received the offering, the protagonist asked her to release one more seal. When the offering was finally accepted, a great green light emanated and enveloped the priest once again. Daylight broke and Marnix still had the sphere in his hands. His large green eye gazed upon the landscape ahead of him. That part of the city wasn't destroyed, and he noticed someone approaching. The protagonist looked somewhat excited at the approaching figure, and seemed to recognize her. The figure before him appeared to be a young girl with bandaged arms, just like the hand of the goddess. The young girl looked at the boy, and placed her bandaged hand on her face. As usual, the priest looked at that girl with a smile. To be sure, it was his goddess. The protagonist placed his hand on the girl's face. A genuine smile showed that he knew it was her. The girl was a child who could barely walk, and asked the protagonist why she was still a child. When the protagonist tried to ask the goddess something, the girl simply looked at him, trying to hear clearly. The priest wanted to know if another deity's divinity was flowing inside that dead incarnation. He wanted to find a way to acquire it, but she was already dissolving and turning into dust. However, the girl raised her bandaged hand toward that dust. She seemed to be straining, her expression firm, as she thrust both hands toward the dissolving remains. She knelt and began to cry, realizing she couldn't contain the divinity. Smiling, the priest told the goddess she didn't need to try so hard, and could simply return to stay by his side. Returning and hugging the protagonist, the young girl seemed calmer as he said, "It was because everything was a mess." The girl cried while looking at the protagonist, saying she still couldn't return to her original form. Holding the green sphere in hand, she said they had now unlocked the seal of the sacred relic. With 10,000 divinities, she asked the goddess to grant her a favor while saying this, and that sphere glowed green, just like the eyes of the goddess of corruption. When he said he would need a new authority from the heavens, an intense light appeared. The intense light that descended from the sky formed the core of a massive energy. That energy enveloped the protagonist in a sphere of light. The priest, with fascinated eyes, asked the goddess what the meaning of that new authority was. The goddess in that small body clenched her fists, her cheeks turning red, and said he could use it as much as he wanted. As he walked with the little goddess, the protagonist told her that power was far too strong. Smiling, the protagonist thought that the curse of corruption he had just received was an authority dangerously close to the demonic. With that authority, all living beings within the range of a small city would rot slowly. To the priest, it would be fine if they were villains, or people who had already passed. But doing that to innocents would be wrong. With the relic shattered on the ground, the next question was why the sacred relic had been sealed inside an incarnation. The priest looked at that young woman with intense eyes, and thought that perhaps it wasn't just a coincidence. With what was left of the relic, which was slowly vanishing, he wondered if the goddess was being used. If that was the case, and they were creating the incarnation with the goddess's powers, they would have a serious problem. Looking at the young goddess and thinking about the problem already gave him a headache. He had received many attacks imbued with divinity, and now felt dizzy in front of the goddess. Moments later, the priest collapsed unconscious on the ground. The young goddess with brown eyes and black hair cried, and in her eyes were reflected the priest's green ones. Her tears now fell onto the protagonist's face, who lay on the ground. She wept upon seeing that he had reached his limit. However, at a certain moment, it seemed her eyes filled with energy and widened. She noticed Carmen standing before her, smiling and saying that the protagonist had finally woken up. As soon as he realized he was awake, he suddenly reached for his chest, and from the look on his face, he seemed to be forgetting something. In a burst, he sat up and asked Carmen where his things were. The young man asked Priest Manarch to calm down, and promised to explain everything. But the priest, in a panic, screamed and demanded his things immediately. However, when he heard the goddess's essence within him, he gradually calmed down. Harmon seemed to know that the contents of that cloth were very important to his friend and priest. That's why he handed him the bandaged hand of the goddess, and now the protagonist could hold it in his hand much calmer. He said he thought he had lost it, and Carmen replied that he believed it had a meaning, so he kept it, even though others said it wasn't something worth carrying. He held on to the bandaged hand for the priest. The protagonist, radiant like someone who had received a new toy, pressed the goddess's hand to his chest, Carmen, seeing the protagonist so happy, put a hand on his head and said it was nothing. The friend remembered that if it weren't for the priest's sacrifice, who had jumped off a horse in Kelton at a certain moment, things could have gone badly. And now the priest wanted to know exactly where they were. But the friend explained they were still in the same city, and it had already been 10 days with people rebuilding. Despite everything being ruined, there were still people from neighboring towns trying to help with the recovery. When the priest asked if there were any survivors, Carmen explained that the only living person was the priest himself. Now a beautiful landscape framed a ruined city. Sometime later, a bit farther away, a man was wounded in the legs by a dagger. He seemed desperate to escape from people trying to capture him. Now, with the injury in his legs, he couldn't walk anymore, and so he fell into the snow-white boots. Walked toward the man. Not only he, but many others had been captured and turned into slaves, and the person hunting those slaves was a tall, young woman with blue hair. When she stared at the man with her blue hair and eyes, he screamed, begging her not to do anything to him. Still with the dagger in his leg, he was in immense pain. The woman harshly said he would no longer be able to walk. The man swore he could still move at the same speed, even with his injured leg. He screamed through tears that he wouldn't try to run again. But the woman didn't seem to have any remorse. Unleashing her weapon, she separated his head from his body with a single strike. After that, she closed her eyes and invoked a sacred flame. She asked that flame to burn while the body lay on the ground. After her words, the blue flame began to spread over the man's body. The woman wished for that man's sins to burn alongside his body and head. The other should have been captured as slaves. Mourned for that could be their tragic fate too. The woman, in a harsh tone, ordered everyone to keep walking without hesitation. Now short and weary steps could be seen in the snow. Those people were exhausted, but they were obligated to keep walking. If they didn't, there was already a weapon waiting for them, and the result would be the same as their comrades. The snowy, mountainous landscape held the footprints left by those people. A local guard was surprised to see several bandits before him, and asked if that person was handing them all over. One of the bandits, with a bruised, purple eye, cried out that they were all bandits, and called themselves the Snow Bears. All of them, without exception, knelt in a row and begged. They pleaded for the guard to take them, for they wanted to go straight to a prison far away from that woman. The blue-haired woman said that if that's what they wanted, the guard should grant their wish. However, the guard informed her that Lord Kelton, the one who had placed the bounty on those men, had passed away, relying on a follower of the evil spirit. She believed it would take about a day for her to receive the reward. Still contemplating the image of those mountains, the woman asked what had happened to the worshippers. The tale was sung. That priest Manarch had destroyed all of them 10 days ago. That woman had already heard of the demon-slaying priest from GIS. Because of that, she wanted to be sure they were talking about the same priest, Manarch, and asked the guard. Elsewhere, the priest was having a friendly meal with Carmen, who insisted on recounting the protagonist's heroic deeds. A blue-haired woman asked the guard if the priest was still in Kelton. Some already drunk friends were setting out on an adventure to a new bar in a tavern. A blond young man drank until his cheeks were flushed, and listened to a question about the priest. With that large mug of beer, he tried to hear the question properly. The blue-haired woman wanted to know if the priest was still in that town, and where he was. However, everyone there was heavily intoxicated. She heard things like, the priest was the very air that stood against evil spirits. Asking about him in that bar wasn't going to satisfy her curiosity. Meanwhile, two friends rode off somewhere. Marnak and Carmen, on their horses, raced through the snow at high speed. The priest, still on horseback, remembered when the Lord wanted to tell him something. He recalled being face to face with the Lord, who spoke of a blue-haired priestess from the sacred flame set. She had been looking for him, but the Lord revealed that he refused to give any information. The priest asked if she was sure he was alive, and the Lord said she had implied she wasn't certain. However, he made it clear that when they mentioned the search for him, her eyes showed no intention of giving up. At the time, the priest even clenched his teeth, knowing it would become a problem now. Galloping at high speed through the snow, he told the goddess he was already aware of. He and his friend were moving away from Kelton. The woman's white boots roamed the towns, always in search of the priest. The priest knew that the blue-haired woman had been evaluated by the goddess at 4.5 fingers. Now on his horse, He thanked his friend for agreeing to leave the city so quickly. Carmen said there was no need to worry. He'd rather leave the moment he had the chance than attract attention. His friend's words made a wide smile appear on the protagonist's face. 2 weeks had passed and the two walked peacefully through the snow. The protagonist's smile was still clearly visible on his face. Carmen said he might be wrong, but he believed he had seen a carriage from the Aromal family. The priest seen the carriage, and the people ahead wanted to know if by the Aromal family he meant the great lord of the south. And Carmen confirmed it was exactly that person. The carriage bore the crest of the white camellia flower. Indeed, it was the carriage of the Aromal family. Protagonist asked Carmen if he thought it was right to greet them, since they were heading their way. Carmen didn't think it was wise, since they hadn't raised the Lord's banner. Maybe it was just relatives. And that carriage kept getting closer to the protagonist and Carmen. They didn't even look in that direction, passing by as if they didn't know anyone. But something caught the protagonist's attention. It felt latent. Carmen noticed the change in his friend's face. The moment he looked at him, that's when the priest warned Carmen that someone was tied up inside the carriage. Upon looking, Carmen saw that all who patrolled the carriage raised their weapons. Those mercenaries told the young men they'd let them go if they pretended they hadn't seen anything. Now one of the mercenaries gave a wide, malicious grin and called for his whole group. Those men thought it would be easy to overpower the two, since they were outnumbered. As soon as he shouted to eliminate them all, a massive explosion was seen. Someone's head rolled far from them and from its own body. It hadn't just been severed by a sword. It also had an arrow embedded in it. The mercenaries, upon seeing what had happened to one of their comrades, began to sweat coldly. One of them, the half-headed one, asked how they dared raise a sword against them, still wielding his sword. The priest said he already knew they were kidnappers. With a meticulous look, he warned his partner of that only 8 remained. This made the mercenaries feel the weight of what was coming. The man who held someone at sword point told his subordinates not to fear those 2 weaklings. It was also told to everyone that they should hurry with the cleanup. As time was limited, the bald man giving the orders was so furious that the veins on his forehead were bulging, and it was right in that direction that an arrow was lodged in his head. The protagonist's young friend, the archer, was the one who pulled off this feat. He seemed satisfied to see that his aim had succeeded. Carmen, looking in that direction, saw that the carriage had now collapsed, and the priest was near a woman suffering from severe nausea. When Carmen asked if he already knew the woman's name, the sweating priest said he wasn't in any condition. He also told his friend he wasn't sure if the girl had been drugged, but she was still incapacitated, even with all those mercenaries on the ground. Protagonist mentioned that the girl's eyes were honey-colored. The girl asked the priest to stop patting her back, as it only made the nausea worse. Carmen's eyes widened, and he blushed slightly upon seeing the young woman before him. The beautiful young woman with long white hair, grateful for being saved, said she was the eldest daughter of Calto. She said her name was Dakia, and that young woman truly had golden eyes. Carmen thought that if she really was Dakia, daughter of the smiling young master, then she must be a mage. The protagonist, upon learning that the young woman was a noble mage, didn't seem pleased. Looking at that girl with white hair and golden eyes, he could already tell she would be extremely rude. Carmen, on the other hand, thought that even if she was a noble and a mage, they could deal with that later. That young man who liked to look at women with generous hearts was speaking to the priest. While the girl seemed to understand what they were talking about, she coughed to draw their attention. She looked at the two and said she wanted to know the name of the one who saved her life. The protagonist introduced himself, saying he was Priest Marnak, who served the goddess of preservation. The young woman smiled upon hearing the priest's name, saying it wasn't a bad name. However, she raised an issue, saying she had serious trouble walking. She wanted to know if one of them could help her a little. With trembling legs, she explained that the anesthetic gas she had been forced to inhale was still in her system. Quickly, Carmen offered to help Miss Takea, introducing himself as the son of Andes Valtes. The girl, upon hearing his surname, asked if he truly wanted to help her. Looking firmly at the young man, she said, "Could be unpleasant if people saw the black prairie dog with her." The priest watched as the girl spoke, in a threatening tone to his friend, saying that at the very least he should be considerate. After saying that, She looked at the protagonist's face and asked if he agreed with her. Upon doing so, both of them widened their eyes, and concluded that the girl was a noble, besides being a mage. They looked at her as she tried to decipher their thoughts. With newfound courage, Carmen asked the young lady what had led her to such a humiliating situation. She said that although she didn't have solid proof of the culprit, she had a strong feeling of who it was. That left the priest unsure about what she was saying. The girl with white hair and golden eyes said it was obvious the kidnapping had been planned by her brother. It was a premeditated act by Dursel Aramel, and upon saying his name, the priest, keeping a sharp eye on the young woman, judged that her story could be true. While she spoke, he reflected on how in noble families, mages were rarely welcomed. Now the priest, with a more serious expression, concluded that none of the sorcerers were well accepted in those households. The image of the young girl with white hair came to his mind, avoided by nobles just because she was a mage. Every time she passed near a hallway, she would hear offensive whispers, constantly judged for using magic. The frail girl was constantly rejected. Even though she was born into a noble family, none of the mages or sorcerers were well regarded, as many said it was hard to teach them proper manners. Besides the clear prejudice, there was also an old superstition that followed magic users. Because of that, it was rare to see a sorcerer in a position of prominence or leadership. There was a belief dating back to times before the Old Empire that mages could never reign. Now the three of them were in a quieter part of the forest, gathered around a campfire. Enjoying a meal, the priest remained calm and thoughtful, reflecting that if she wanted to claim a prominent position as a sorceress, she would have to deal with her own brother. The young woman seemed at ease around the two men, even showing a slight smile during the conversation. However, as soon as she began to tell her own story, her expression turned tense, making the priest visibly uncomfortable. She continued her account, saying she knew both men were interested in her words. Carmen wanted her to go on with her story, and even tried to guess what she would say next. The priest, noticing how irritated the young woman was, assured her that both he and his friend were paying attention. But the young woman shot the priest an unfriendly look, trying to ease the tension. He commented that she was so caught up in telling her story that she let the meat on the skewer burn. When she looked, the meat was indeed slightly overcooked, so he handed her his own skewer, where the meat was still juicy and flavorful, which drew an unexpected smile from the young woman. As he gave her the skewer, he remarked that maybe she'd feel better if she cooked a little less next time. Smiling, he said that cooking meat just right was easy. All you had to do was talk less. The young woman didn't appreciate those sharp words coming from the priest. The fireplace remained lit and the moon shone high in the sky. Meanwhile, the young woman resumed the conversation, saying she had a proposal and wanted to hear their answer. The priest, just by looking at her, already suspected what her proposal would be, and upon hearing it, he confirmed his guess. She wanted the two of them to escort her to her home. She promised to reward them with gold, equivalent to each of their weights. As she said this, her expression turned serious, showing that something important was at stake. The priest couldn't hide his excitement at the mention of gold or great rewards. His eyes were already gleaming. His mouth curled into a goofy smile, unable to conceal his fascination with the glint of precious metal. However, the original client of that journey was Carmen, who was already growing uneasy as he stared at his compass. Seeing his companion concerned about the time the escort might take, he considered turning down the offer. He also remembered the moment Carmen returned the goddess's hand to him, preventing it from burning. If it were up to the priest alone, he would have set aside the gold offer and followed Carmen to his destination. But the goddess seemed to have other plans in mind. Understanding what she wanted, the priest joked, comparing himself to gold on a scale. When Carmen raised his hand, clenched in a fist, it looked like he was about to make a decision. The girl in the night, realizing this, grew excited, for they would now get what they needed. Carmen, determined to honor his family name, took it upon himself to protect that young woman. After a long trek through the snow, step by step, the group pressed on with determination. The priest finally saw the next city appearing in the distance, which made the young woman quite excited. She ran happily as she would finally return home and enjoy a nice, hot bath. However, before anything else, they stopped at an inn, wanting to bathe and have some beer. Smiling, Carmen approached the two, and informed them he had reserved 3 rooms on the 3rd floor. The priest's plan was simple. Everyone would bathe and then gather for dinner together. The inn, though small, was clean and cozy. The food didn't take long to arrive, and they all ate with pleasure, satisfying their built-up hunger. While eating, the priest paid attention to something that was bothering him. He couldn't relax, as a young woman serving the table next to them was being harassed. A man with blonde hair and a mohawk and a thick beard, arms crossed, approached the table with a threatening expression. He warned the other men to stop bothering her, but one of them wasn't intimidated. While the soup was still on the counter, the man wanted to know when he had supposedly bothered the girl. Carmen, chewing slowly, commented to the priest that the atmosphere was getting tense, and he thought they should intervene. But someone acted first and didn't wait. A strong punch landed squarely on the man's face. The impatient one was the white-haired young woman, clearly outraged by the situation. With a single blow, she sent the man flying a good distance, shocking everyone present. Priest in the back observed the scene with a satisfied expression. When another man tried to act disrespectfully, a hand grabbed his head firmly. His face was slammed against the table with force. It was the priest who wouldn't tolerate disrespect before his eyes. After the impact, he lifted the man's head to see if the punishment had been enough. Seeing the man had learned his lesson, he let him go with a smile on his face. The young woman, after dishing out her own lesson, was applauded enthusiastically by the crowd and the tavern owner. Carmen, in turn, was gripping another man by the collar, one who had also acted disrespectfully. When the man fell to his knees, Carmen opened his arms and commented that, after all, they were just travelers, with her hand on the young mage's head. She admitted that injustice made her furious. The priest simply observed her words attentively. Then, seeing her from behind, he reflected that her problem wasn't a lack of emotional control. Curious, Carmen searched the disrespectful man's pockets and found some coins. Without hesitation, he tossed the coins to the priest. Upon catching them, the priest handed them to the tavern owner. To make up for the damages caused by the commotion, peace now reigned in that tavern. With the innkeeper satisfied, night fell quickly, and soon someone knocked at the door. The white-haired young woman asked who it was, and a voice on the other side replied that they needed to speak with her. When she opened the door smiling, she found Priest Manarch standing there. Startled, she fell silent as he covered her mouth and held her head firmly. With sword in hand, he struck the wall near her with force just to get her attention. He told her that all she had to do was listen in silence. As he feared waking Carmen, with his eyes glowing green and a tense expression, he asked if she understood clearly, still locking his gaze on her. He reminded her that earlier, she had said she couldn't ignore injustice when it happened before her eyes. He also remembered her saying that she should have let it go, at least in that situation, since they were being pursued by forces they didn't understand. She herself should know how important it was not to draw attention, and if she acted like that again, she would ruin everything. Still holding her head against the wall, the priest warned that if she repeated that behavior, he wouldn't hesitate to strike her, pointing that object at her with a threatening look. He cut off any attempt at a response and asked if she had understood, demanding that she nod slowly if she had. The girl, eyes wide with fear and brow raised, nodded in agreement after realizing she understood. He gave a small crooked smile, finally releasing her head. He looked back toward the door and coldly wished her a good night. After he left, the girl remained frozen, now breathing heavily with her mouth open, shaken by the intense scare. Leaving the room, the priest spoke to his goddess, explaining that he had to act that way to prevent the situation from escalating. As he walked down the hall, he said they couldn't risk being discovered at this point in the mission. While he talked with the goddess, the young woman remained in the room, now sitting on her own legs, overwhelmed by a feeling of desolation. But the priest knew there wasn't much he could do, for the girl seemed to suffer from a compulsive disorder related to justice. At that moment, the scene shifted to reveal a grand, luxurious mansion inside it. Someone needed to explain why the attempt to kidnap Takia had failed, while another person sat silently. Person reporting trembled with fear, explaining that more financial resources would be needed to continue the mission. But the contractor, irritated, said he had already given enough money, and with his nails painted black, called the informant closer. The man who received a slap across the face was the regional manager of the world's secret organization. Now the employer demanded to know in detail the reason behind the operation's extra cost. Sitting on the floor, the manager touched his face, still red from the blow, while thinking of how to explain. With lips trembling from fear and sorrow, he took a deep breath and summoned the courage to speak. He thought of his wife and children, and knew that if he didn't face the situation, he would be putting both his life and his family's at risk. So he bowed until his forehead touched the floor, demonstrating submission and desperation. He said, everything had happened because of the interference of a priest devoted to the dignity of preservation. He explained that the priest involved was known as the Demon Slayer. Upon hearing that name, the noble-looking man became even more enraged, baring all his teeth in fury. The manager, seeing the fury before him, decided to reveal that this priest wasn't just any man. He explained that the priest had defeated a demon that transformed into a colossal monster. He also reported the priest's recent feats in Kelton, where he had killed a creature created by the cultists. He recalled that the man had faced everything alone, and had thus earned the title of arch-nemesis of evil spirits. That man with pointed ears and golden eyes began paying much closer attention upon hearing of such deeds. The manager then added that the priest was also accompanied by the eldest son of Volts. It was at that moment that the golden-eyed man asked if the two were in possession of Daikya. Still on the ground, the manager gave a timid smile upon hearing he would receive more resources to continue the mission. With a threatening gaze, the man ordered that next time success must be guaranteed. Despite the slight smile, the manager was sweating and gulping nervously, clearly intimidated. Meanwhile, in the same inn, in the comfort of his own room, the priest was feeding the little goddess. He commented to the tiny one that perhaps he had been too harsh with the white-haired girl. But when the goddess asked why he cared about the girl, he said it was because she was a client. Before he could continue, someone knocked at the door. As soon as the knocks were heard, the goddess quickly hid herself in a green aura. Seeing that it was the young Daikya, the priest told her she could come in. Even as he said that, there was a hint of apprehension in his eyes. The young woman entered the room, closed the door and leaned against it without saying a word. She stared fixedly at something on the bed, visibly intrigued. It was a plate with various foods that the priest used to feed the little goddess. He, noticing her gaze, took the plate off the bed and invited her to sit. Both of them sat at the edge of the bed and remained silent for a few moments, until the young woman broke the silence, asking if the reason for such a harsh reprimand was because she was a mage. As she spoke, he remained silent. Still seated beside her, he seemed to reflect on her words, and after a moment of thought, he replied that yes, that was the reason. The young woman, sighing, said she already knew, as she had seen it in his eyes. He didn't immediately understand what she meant by that look. She continued explaining that she was used to that kind of look from people who had been hurt by mages. But she confessed that, for the first time, that look carried a dose of genuine hatred. She remembered the way he had pushed her against the wall, and covered her mouth even so. With sparkling eyes, she ran her hand across her face, and said she liked the words he had spoken, especially when he said they would be companions from then on, which made the priest blush a little. She went on to say that usually, people who looked at her that way ended up trying to hurt her. Later she stated that if she saw injustice again, she wouldn't be able to hold back, but promised to give a warning first. Standing up from the bed, she said she had only come to say those words. He remained silent when she said she was leaving. She was already at the door when he asked for her attention once more. She stopped and looked at him as he walked up to her, scratching his head and admitting that he had been too harsh. Now, with his face lit up by a sincere smile, the priest acknowledged he had been rude. Upon hearing that, the young woman gave a wide smile. She told him that he was finally looking at her the right way, and that made her happy. He, closing his eyes and trying to maintain seriousness, even while smiling, asked if she was being sincere. Very excited, she asked if they had now made peace, and suggested there be no more resentment between them. Laughing, he replied that on his end, everything was fine and he held no grudge against anyone. She gave a slight smile, winked at him, and slightly blushing, said she was looking forward to starting that adventure. After she left, the priest continued feeding the goddess and reflected that, in the end, mages were also just people, even hearing a few complaints from the goddess. He felt content because hearing her voice brought him peace. The little goddess, while eating, said the priest was finally starting to understand, and as always, he felt happy feeding the little one who seemed to be eating well. A few days later, still at the same inn, some citizens arrived, already intimidating everyone outside. A large bald man kicked the door open. Shouting for the priest, he threatened a blond man with a mohawk, saying he would destroy everything there if he didn't find him. With veins bulging on his face and a furious expression, the bald man ordered that the priest be brought to him immediately. Far from there, someone held a piece of paper in his hands. Though he suspected there was something wrong with the orders he had received, he examined the paper carefully, which bore a strange request regarding the capture of a maiden from the Aromal family. Paper gave off a faint trace of a priest's scent, someone the man didn't yet know well. At the bottom of the document, there was also a drawing of the protagonist's face, identified as Arc, the declared enemy of evil spirits. The man studied the image carefully, sweating profusely and scratching his cheeks. As he stared at the priest's face, while holding the paper in his hands, he heard someone call his name. One of the subordinates informed him that the priest was nearby, but the silver-haired woman was not with him. Sajida grew irritated almost immediately, and demanded to know exactly where the priest was. He wanted to understand whether that man was looking for a fight, or setting up a trap. As he stepped out of his tent, he found the protagonist gripping the neck of the burly bald man. Without thinking twice, Sajida ordered all his subordinates to lower their swords immediately. Noticing that the vassals were slow to obey, he shouted even louder, his face twisted with rage. His tone was so threatening that the mercenaries began to reconsider any thoughts of disobedience. At that moment, Sajida realized he had overlooked something very important. In the contents of the request, he walked forward, face flushed with fury, reflecting on the size of the mess they were in. The priest, meanwhile, simply watched the man approach, not moving a single muscle. Sajida's face showed clear discomfort in the presence of that intimidating stranger. Trying to appear calm, he forced a smile, and asked the priest politely if he was the one called Manarch. He then asked kindly if he would release what he was holding in his right hand. Without hesitation, the priest let go of the brute, causing him to fall to his knees. The protagonist then stated that he wished to have a direct conversation with the leader of the mercenary group. He made it clear with a firm smile that he wasn't there for gains, but neither was he seeking trouble. The man introduced himself as the captain of the Redbeard mercenaries, and revealed his name, Sajida. Sometime later, inside the captain's tent, the priest was invited to sit, and was offered food and drink while Sajida drank. The priest declined the alcohol, saying he wasn't a fan of that kind of beverage. After a sip, Sajida set his cup on the table, and thought that if the priest drank a little, the conversation might flow more easily. However, the priest began recounting something he had heard from one of the captain's men. Earlier, he was referring to the burly bald man, the one who had sought him out that morning, and had kicked the door open without the slightest courtesy. The priest explained that the man said the captain wanted to speak with him, which was why he had come ready to listen. However, he still remembered the chaos at the bar the day before, and suspected it might all be connected. Meanwhile, the captain kept a cheerful face, though he was internally considering his next steps. He was thinking about the silver-haired woman, and whether or not to bring up the curse that had afflicted the alley organization. He stared at the priest, who wore a beastly expression, and feared having to fight someone with such a fearsome reputation. He blamed the vice-captain for all the trouble, for acting impulsively and causing such discomfort. While he was thinking this, someone approached from outside the tent. It was the vice-captain himself, visibly drunk, who wanted to speak to the priest. Upon hearing that the priest had come on his own, he thought the man must be incredibly brave. Entering the tent and seeing the protagonist, he asked if he was the priest. The protagonist confirmed, and the man wanted to know if he had seen a silver-haired maiden. The priest confirmed that there was a woman matching that description in his group. When the vice-captain ordered him to hand over the woman, the captain's eyes widened. In surprise, the vice-captain raised his hand toward the priest, saying something but was abruptly interrupted, as his hand was severed with a single strike. Now the mercenaries watched the hand fly away from the vice-captain's body. The severed hand landed some distance away, while the vice-captain screamed in agony and desperation. The priest calmly stated that he had found something peculiar, and thought it was amusing. He looked around, and commented that he didn't recall giving his name to any of them, yet everyone seemed to pronounce it so affectionately, as if they were close. Standing tall with a threatening glare and gripping his strange, serrated sword, he demanded to know who was behind it all. The captain, in shock, stared at the man, and realized that the question could no longer be avoided. Someone shouted that the vice-captain had lost his arm. Several mercenaries rushed into the tent. Alarmed by the situation, they believed the priest hadn't understood the seriousness of what he was doing. When they saw that he had also severed another man's head, they said he had to be stopped. But instead of attacking, the mercenaries hesitated. Terrified by the priest's cold demeanor, he remained expressionless, even as the scene turned drastically violent. While the captain listened to the vice-captain's cries for help, he simply watched that man lay on the ground trembling, soaked in sweat and begging for someone to save him. The protagonist, still standing, kept his serrated blade pointed at him. He was about to deliver the finishing blow, as the man refused to answer. However, before he could strike, the tip of a spear appeared and stopped the blade's advance. Surprised, the priest looked back and saw that the captain had intervened. He held the spear firmly, preventing the final blow from being delivered. The captain said that his bond with the vice-captain was deep, with over 15 years of companionship. He said that for that reason, he couldn't allow this to happen. Even so, the protagonist easily dodged his attacks, until with a precise movement, he cut the captain's spear. The broken piece flew far from his hand, and he still tried to reach for it, but without success. Soon after, a large hand appeared pulling a curtain. That man grabbed the cloth, in hopes of shielding himself from the priest's blows, but the priest only watched as the captain threw the curtain over him, and ran off as he easily slashed through the fabric. The priest saw the captain fleeing in a rush, leaving the vice behind while running. The captain shouted for his men to retreat as quickly as possible. The mercenaries were left stunned, watching their own leader escape the scene. For many of them, it was too late to react. Countless heads were separated from their bodies. Now, with wide eyes, they paid the price for having stood still too long. Those who understood the danger ran, desperately trying to save their lives among the fugitives. Some managed to escape the protagonist's blade. The captain, knowing that flaying wouldn't be so easy, stopped and grabbed another spear. He took a defensive stance, realizing he had no choice but to tell the truth. Standing alert, he saw the protagonist take position again, ready for another clash, although still at some distance. He noticed him slowly emerging from the tent. The priest, in silence, communicated with his goddess, knowing he had to capture the true mastermind behind the tracking. His body began to emit a green essence, while his eyes gleamed with an intense light. Sajida continued to fight fiercely, and his eyes already revealed the threat he carried. But when he hurled his spear toward the priest, the opponent shoved one of his allies in front, letting him take the blow instead. Wasting no time, the protagonist positioned his sword precisely before the enemy. The opponent quickly realized things were going to get a bit more complicated from here, especially when he saw the priest wasn't playing around, and simply sliced the man in half. He now ran after the captain, clearly aiming to cut him down just like before. Knowing escape was impossible without a fight, Captain grabbed a new spear, repositioning himself firmly. He knew he had to block the attacks coming his way. Fortunately, he managed to stop the priest's sword from piercing his flesh. At that moment, it was a close call, and the second strike nearly hit him too, leaving him visibly shaken. While gripping the spear tightly, he shouted to his subordinates to head to the vice-captain's tent. The battle was intense, and even while fighting, the captain wanted to make sure someone checked on his friend. For now, he could still avoid being struck directly by the protagonist's blows. Watching him, he noticed that his eyes were now completely green, like the most vivid leaf. Every time he looked at the priest's face, he felt that sooner or later he would be fatally struck. And now the priest stood right in front of him, fist clenched and with that intense green stare. This time, the captain couldn't simply block the blow and was struck with force. From the impact, a blinding light and dust erupted, covering much of the area around them. As the priest landed the hit on the captain, his face held an enigmatic expression, and even in the middle of the fight, he let out a sincere smile. He was pleased it had been a long time since he'd faced someone with such high resistance. He liked seeing that the captain had managed to withstand a blow, and was still alive even so. The pain on the captain's face was clear. He even clenched his teeth from it. At that exact moment, the captain shouted that someone was firing at them. The priest looked around, unaware that an archer was hidden among them, while the captain held the spear. With one hand, the other was partially wounded from the blow. The two remained silent, staring intensely at each other, and the priest thought it would be bad if an arrow struck them now. The surroundings were filled with ice, footprints, and several fallen people. While the two kept watching each other from a distance, one of the mercenaries observed the scene with a tense gaze, the veins in his neck bulging. None of the mercenaries wanted to stay there and be the next target, so they decided to abandon the captain. Finding himself alone, the priest asked the captain if he still wanted to continue that fight. He smiled and said there would be no problem if he chose to give up, since all the others had already fled. With no other option, the captain threw his spear to the ground and declared that he had lost. After surrendering now face to face with the protagonist, he said he would tell everything he knew. They began placing stakes in the shape of crosses as they talked. During the conversation, the captain looked at the scattered crosses and answered the protagonist's questions. He wanted to know if the captain harbored hatred or resentment toward him. The captain, staring at him, knew that saying he hated him could make things worse. The priest then made it clear that he would not spare anyone who deeply hated him. Sajida gave a smile and agreed that he was right to say that. As they both observed the large number of crosses, the captain decided to take the initiative and said he would be straightforward. He commented that mercenary work sometimes involved eliminating people or being eliminated. He said that living in barracks and working with mercenaries who had recently killed his friends was contradictory. He stated that he had never hunted anyone with an axe. Suki neither hated nor liked the protagonist. He recalled the mercenary banner and affirmed that the organization had been bankrupt for a long time. That's when the protagonist asked the captain what he planned to do from then on. With a tired smile, the captain replied that he didn't know. It had been 15 years since he last felt what it was like to be alone. That's why he felt a little lost. But he needed to reflect, and would probably end up working as a mercenary again. The protagonist heard this with a satisfied look, as if thinking of something important. He shared his thought with the man in front of him, advising him to choose a decent employer this time. With those words, the captain looked again at the priest, who said it would be better to find someone who paid well. That made the captain widen his eyes and look toward the horizon. Visibly deep in thought, sometime later, they returned to the inn, where the silver-haired girl was visibly irritated. Even though the three of them were seated at the table, surrounded by food, silence reigned, until the priest asked the girl if she was staring at him like that because of his dirty clothes. Angrily, she replied that he was perfectly clean, but the priest knew her voice was full of thorns. Upset, Takia wanted to know why he left in secret without telling anyone. She recalled the conversation they had the night before. While sitting on his bed, she thought they had become closer. With her hand on her chin, she asked if she had misunderstood something from that conversation. She also remembered how he had pinned her against the wall and covered her mouth, telling her not to act rashly. Now sitting at the table, still upset, she said he had left without even saying goodbye, treating her like royalty. The priest decided to ask a question. She looked at him intently, as he asked if she had ever dealt with someone before. Tilting her head downward as if in deep thought, she replied that she had never taken anyone's life. He confessed that was exactly why he went alone. Some actions needed to be taken with firmness, but that didn't lessen her feelings, and she said he should have at least explained himself. As he thought about all that, the priest reflected that he hadn't told her, so she wouldn't worry, but next time he would let her know. At that moment, the three of them noticed someone approaching, restless, shouting for Dakia. Looking toward the door, they saw it was Carmen, yelling that the priest had gone off to negotiate with mercenaries. Now everyone was at the table with cheerful faces, listening to Carmen insist they should grab their weapons and go help the priest. Only after a while, once calmer, did he realize the protagonist was right there, safe and eating. He also noticed the presence of a stranger sitting at the table. Approaching, he asked the protagonist who that person was, and the priest explained that he was a new mercenary. That's when the two introduced themselves, with a firm and strong handshake. The silver-haired girl watched the gesture with suspicion, and asked the priest if he trusted that man. Upon hearing that no one trusted him, the captain scratched his head. Visibly embarrassed Carmen lightened the mood by saying, "It was good to have a strong and sturdy companion among them." Soon after, he announced that he was heading out to check on some arrows with the village blacksmith. He also said that as soon as the sun rose, they would set out on their next journey early. Meanwhile, in the dead of night, someone could be seen using magic and commanding undead creatures. The pink-haired girl was in shock, and asked several times when it would happen. She was in an important meeting, and demanded that her two companions reveal the exact moment of arrival. One of the men, blonde with an impressive mustache, questioned whether they were really sure they were going to that place. Despite the doubt, he felt satisfied, at least, to have arrived before the young woman lost it from so much whining. The calmest among them, with reddish hair, calmly said it would be soon, as he had already confirmed the location. That information brought an excited smile to the face of the pink-haired girl, who insisted on knowing if he was really sure. She moved closer to the redhead, wanting to confirm if they were truly arriving in Eredico. The red-haired person, still lying down and flipping through a book, asked why she doubted so much. She claimed she believed it, but the moment made her tense, which resulted in a strange smile accompanied by a few threats. Soon her eyes lit up with a pink glow, and the smile became more twisted, as she said she would tear everyone into little pieces. Meanwhile, someone walked through the snow with a wide smile, already happy they had finally arrived. It was the silver-haired girl, who stopped and looked back, while chatting cheerfully with her friends. Carmen observed the city of Eredico in the distance, and said he couldn't wait for a hot bath. From afar, a figure watched the group, not immediately recognizing who they were, but as soon as he identified the priest and the protagonist, he also turned his gaze in their direction. The person started running, urgently asking if he really was the demon-slaying priest. Man took the protagonist's hand and said he was begging with all his soul. He pointed in a direction and pleaded for the priest to speak with someone who needed help. That person wouldn't listen even to the city's lord, and continued summoning undead without pause. The man told the priest he would pay him well, while Manarch placed a hand on his head and said he didn't believe that would change anything. The man insisted that he at least try, and the captain, looking at Carmen, concluded that it wouldn't hurt to try. With a distressed face and terrified eyes, the man said he and his companions were at their limit. He described how the undead roamed the city every night, terrorizing the population. As he pleaded, the protagonist remained still, silently listening to the desperate request. Opening his arms toward the man, he told him not to expect much, but it lit up the beggar's face. Priest declared he would help, and said he would catch up with the group later, asking them to go ahead and find lodging. Smiling, the silver-haired girl said it was all right and that they would move on. Now walking alone in the snow with a lit torch in hand, the protagonist reflected on the priests. He wondered why, out of all of them, the chosen one had to be the trumpeter of rest. He was a strange type, but also unique, recognized by the other gods as deserving of authority. On a random occasion, and for no apparent reason, the gods had granted a human the gift of summoning. This gift consisted of awakening the dead, and bearing the title of trumpeter of the dead and of rest. The chosen ones were then to wear a special robe, and dedicate their lives to serving the dead. The reason they lived this way was a deep mystery, and the sound of their trumpets remained enigmatic. No one understood why someone would want to awaken the dead, but trumpeters appeared in places full of corpses. There they blew their silent trumpets, and gathered undead armies around them. Nobles and royalty limited themselves to watching from the window, holding golden goblets, filled with liquid gold and encrusted with diamonds. They never dared to touch the dead, commanded by the trumpeters of rest. It made sense, as no one wanted to face an undead army that grew larger every night. With slow steps in the snow, the protagonist pondered that it was something anyone would want to avoid. Smiling with irony, he imagined that the trumpeters of rest must live in complete solitude. As he approached the trumpeter still holding the torch, the protagonist greeted him with respect. However, he received no reply. as the mysterious figure merely watched him in silence. Priest then commented that many had already tried to speak to him, but he acknowledged he couldn't refuse a request for help. Still smiling, he said that for ordinary people, the wandering of the undead was disturbing and disgusting. He looked at the dead, then at their master, and asked if there was a greater reason for being there. The trumpeter said he didn't stay long in any city, always moving from place to place. Then he revealed it was because of the followers of the evil spirit that he needed to keep moving, pointing in a direction. The trumpeter said they were the ones responsible for so many deaths. The protagonist looked back upon hearing that, trying to grasp the seriousness of the situation, maybe gritting his teeth and raising an eyebrow. He braced himself for whatever was coming. He immediately positioned himself to attack, convinced it wouldn't be like what happened in the city of Kelton. He dashed toward the city, determined to prevent the same horrors from repeating. After a long time, someone was walking through the flames, searching for something that seemed lost. It was the pink-haired girl, complaining that he was nowhere to be found. But the red-haired man insisted that his companions had already confirmed the protagonist had entered the city, pointing at him. The girl demanded that he be found quickly without wasting time. The blonde man with a large mustache, however, asked them to wait. He had just located him amidst the flames. The mustached man pointed in a direction and looked away, as if hesitating to face what he saw. Indeed, it was the protagonist emerging from the fire, causing a stir in the pink-haired girl. The priest now carried a wicked aura, with only one of his green eyes glowing intensely, with a grin bordering on madness. He thought that he would finally witness a place like this. The mustached man watched the priest emerge from the flames, wielding an unusual sword. The weapon play within the fire, it was the priest's ritualistic saw. Already well known, he walked through the flames, as if his jagged blade could slice even the fire itself. Seeing the pink-haired girl's excitement, the priest thought he would need to keep calm, showing his teeth in a sinister smile. He told himself there was no need to worry about that. He stared at the mustached man and spoke to the goddess, claiming he would take care of that cursed mage. That man had been responsible for his death, back then, right at the beginning of his journey. It was him who eliminated both his savior and the protagonist himself, without hesitation or mercy. He remembered the day he opened his eyes and saw that it was snowing. He recalled raising his hand and thinking that he had always carried unnecessary worries. He also remembered how someone had been walking through the snow. Looking in his direction, it was a young man who seemed to have found something unexpected among the falling flake. And so the man decided to get closer and check if the fallen person was still alive. The protagonist lay on the ground, arms spread, lost in the endless white of the blizzard. The man was seeking an answer as the snowstorm grew more intense. That was the moment the protagonist opened his eyes and met his savior. The man, whose name was Shantux, carried the protagonist on his back through the thick snow. Despite being an ordinary person, he was neither too young nor too old. That calm man took the youth to his home and began caring for his health attentively. When the protagonist woke up in that place, he wasn't bombarded with questions by the stranger. In that simple home, all the man said was that he could stay there as long as he needed. Above the door was a crest that indicated he was a priest of the goddess of preservation. Additionally, he was also a grave digger, living on the outskirts of the city, far from urban chaos. One day, while helping him dig, the protagonist asked why he had been so kind and had saved him. The man paused, smiling calmly with the shovel still in hand, and answered simply with a friendly look. He said he had just felt like helping someone in need. Back then, the protagonist wasn't used to smiling, but he learned a new kind of smile that day. That light and happy expression became something special, etched into the young man's heart. Shantux helped the elderly, children, and anyone in need, never looking for a reason, trying to follow his example. The protagonist began helping with the children in the village. He remembered living a year of peace, always beside that kind-hearted priest. However, everything changed the following winter, when he decided to follow in his savior's footsteps. In the snow, he found a man who had fainted and did the same, carried him on his shoulders and took him home. But he deeply regretted it, for he should never have saved that damned mage. After receiving care, the man quickly recovered, then revealed his true nature. With a repulsive grin on his lips, he confessed to being a worshipper of the evil spirit with dark magic. He tore the protagonist's body into pieces as if he were a toy. He still smiled, pleased with his cruelty. As blood stained the snow around them, the protagonist woke again. Surrounded by a magical aura of green hue, he noticed that one of the hands he had hidden had somehow slipped out of his inventory. It was caressing his face and cheeks, radiating an intense and mysterious green light. Upon returning home, he had to face the consequences of his naive choice. Right at the entrance on the ground lay Shantuk's corpse, brutally slain by the damned mage. Now in the present he wielded a serrated blade sword, and slashed through the blazing flames. The mage widened his eyes. As he finally remembered where he had seen that gaze before, he pointed and said he was the grave digger, staring into the green eyes filled with thirst for vengeance. Sarcastically, the mage placed a hand on his waist and said, "That boy had died long ago." Members of his group listened. As the mage explained how he had personally eliminated him, the protagonist clenched his fists tightly. Upon noticing that the mage was wearing the priest's robes, the long-mustached mage confessed he wasn't just using the clothes, but also his hand. He displayed his arms, and said that hand had been extremely useful for a full 3 years. The protagonist's fury intensified, the veins on his face bulging like green serpents. The pink-haired violet-eyed girl said she had heard a lot about him. With an eager face, she said she had been looking forward to their meeting, but was completely ignored. The priest simply swept his sword past her as he ran, since his target was ahead. When he hurled the sword at the mage, the latter raised a magical shield in defense, hiding behind the barrier. The mage remarked that the priest was nothing like the rumors. He sneered with disdain, while the priest growled and barked for him to shut up. At a certain moment, the goddess of corruption raised her hand, and a new terror swept across the battlefield. Seeing that the mage was stunned, disbelief spreading through his entire body, that was when the protagonist effortlessly shattered the mage's magical shield. Now inside, he violently tore off the hand that didn't belong to him. However, he was puzzled to hear the pink-haired girl whispering in his ear. He remembered separating her head from her body just moments earlier. Meanwhile, the mage before him began casting a spell, called the Scale of Retribution. That mustached man lifted one leg while performing the arcane ritual. His eyes were those of madness, and his grin revealed every tooth in his mouth. A blinding light engulfed the area, thick with dust and growing destruction. The spell's force was so intense that the red-haired girl had to shield herself with her arms. The winds only fueled the flames, and the dust made everything harder to see. Nothing was visible for a moment, but soon the protagonist could be seen collapse. His sword gone, a voice said. The divine power within him wasn't from the goddess of preservation. It added that the priestly robe's blessing still worked perfectly. The mage, looking down from above, said the protagonist had to be a worshipper of evil spirits. Eyes burning with hatred, the protagonist commanded the filthy mage to shut up. The mage, grinning widely, believed he had hit the mark about the evil worship. That was when the white giant of the goddess of corruption appeared. Towering and furious, the mage looked up, mesmerized by the monstrous authority approaching. He figured that since he'd lost his left arm, he might as well take the monsters. Even seeing the corruption giant about to strike him, he didn't back away an inch. Dust from the impact shot up to the skies as the protagonist gritted his teeth and restrained fury. Despite the powerful attack, the mage blocked the giant's punch with extreme ease. It became clear that the blonde, large-mustached man was a worthy enemy. The protagonist now emanated even more of his green essence. Drenched in vengeance, he thought that tonight he would completely destroy the mage Reverko. He locked his gaze on that filthy mage's face, knowing he would do anything to eliminate him. In another area not far from that chaotic scene, some rather strange civilians were being repeatedly struck. Sajida, ripping his spear firmly, landed precise blows on the poor wretches who had gone mad. Looking back, he noticed the young girl questioning him with concern, asking if the fallen man had died. With the spear resting on his shoulder, he replied that not yet, but if they didn't act fast, the mad ones would counter-attack fiercely. Harmon, watching the whole mess, could only think of running straight to the burning castle. However, the silver-haired girl looked worried about the priest, fearing he was still amidst that chaos. The former mercenary captain, however, knew someone as impressive as the priest wouldn't fall so easily. Bodies lay in twisted positions across the ground. Amid the eerie flames devouring the landscape, people were scattered everywhere, while the Lord's castle was being consumed by an uncontrollable fury of fire. The castle's entrance was entirely swallowed by flames, a visual hell. Meanwhile, the three companions tried to quickly decide what they should do. In that madness, Armin already suspected that the widespread madness among the population might not be the direct fault of the local Lord Dakia. The proud lady gracefully turned her face toward the voice calling for her attention. Sajida firmly warned that if they didn't take down the madman quickly, they would face truly serious problems. Even amid fire and smoke, the crazed ones began to group up, forcing Sajida to drive his spear into one of their chests. The young woman, watching that with a sorrowful gaze, realized that even against her will, she needed to act immediately. The man, pointing his spear toward the chaos, explained that it was necessary to keep eliminating those people. If she wanted to survive, she should imagine she was doing a favor to the disoriented undead. He said he would handle most of the dirty work himself, but asked her to do what was necessary to stay alive. The girl listened to those words with a carefree smile, as if it were even something pleasant. With an unspoken permission, she gripped the hilt of her sword firmly, showing resolve. She quickly revealed herself to be a promising swordswoman, with sharp reflexes and very well-coordinated movements. Carmen, observing the movement ahead, ordered the group to head immediately to the castle's main gate. As they ran and fought, the three of them continued to eliminate as many of the flaming undead as possible. In one of the attacks, the girl drove her sword straight into the chest of one of the crazed ones, then pulled back. The former mercenary captain heard something that made him stop. It was a familiar voice that caught his attention. Turning in that direction, he noticed the presence of a colossal being wrapped in a glowing violet light focusing his eyes. He realized it was a massive monster, and near it the priest covered in dust and soot. The pink-haired girl, watching the scene nearby, thought it was all incredibly cool. She saw the exact moment the mage stopped the attack of the white giant of corruption with just the palm of his hand. As the girl filled with joy, the red-haired figure behind her said he wanted to resolve everything. Through conversation, looking at the priest, he explained that he couldn't miss this chance, as he had waited a long time to find Marnak. He firmly told the white giant of corruption that they were now ready to begin the promised attack. Obeying the command, the giant clenched its fist tightly, preparing a violent blow toward the mage. With a deafening roar, it declared the start of the most intense battle they had ever witnessed. The mage, for his part, was already preparing his luminous power wrapped in radiant energy. The giant's attack was so powerful that it shattered the mage's magical shield with alarming ease. At this moment, the protagonist was already gripping his saw tightly, ready to give back everything he had received. With a look of deep vengeance and a slightly insane smile, he charged at the enemy on the other side. The mage showed the same thirst for destruction, as if he wanted to eliminate the protagonist a second time. As time passed, the intensity of their blows increased, making the fight more and more brutal. The mage, even while laughing, found the exchange of attacks boring, and provoked the protagonist to use something new. The priest, watching it all, couldn't believe the mage had the audacity to mock so openly, dodging and blocking attacks with ease. The mage kept taunting, saying the other needed to calm down. Just as he was about to release another one of his provocations, he was suddenly pierced by a spear. Everything happened too quickly. The mage didn't even have time to react to the devastating attack. The scene unfolded before the priest's eyes, who now observed everything with a green-tinged calmness. The blade, after piercing the mage, didn't lose momentum, continuing its path through the air with precision. The protagonist, seeing the mage falling with his red cloak, looked in the direction the attack had come from. He recognized the strength and precision of the throw as something only the former mercenary captain could have done. He saw that Sajida was in trouble, surrounded by out-of-control undead as he tried to hold his ground. After helping his comrade with the throw, Sajida had to run off to save his own skin. The protagonist looked at the chest of the fallen mage, but didn't react immediately. Gazing at his saw, He remembered reading somewhere that revenge was a useless thing. Now, with the red-cloaked mage on the ground, he could finally experience that lesson in practice. With a serious expression and traces of slight sadness, he approached thinking he didn't want anything dramatic. Standing before the body, he wondered if the ending really had to be so hollow and futile. With his eyes glowing intensely, he prepared to offer that corpse to the goddess of corruption. But as the energy began to emanate from the body, the protagonist realized that the mage was still alive. He began to release a divine power, as if something had explosively awakened inside him. The mage then remembered the moment his arm had been torn off by the protagonist. Serrated blade, he said, filled with hatred that before anything else, he needed to recover the arm that had been taken from him. The protagonist watched it unfold, and heard the mage's companions express pure terror. The red-haired girl screamed that everyone needed to run immediately, as they were now in real danger. The pink-haired girl wanted to stay, wanted to witness the spectacle. She didn't want to miss such an exciting moment. Against her will, however, she was dragged away by her companion, who shouted that this was sheer irresponsibility. While the pink-haired girl protested, the other pulled her forcefully, telling her to shut up so they wouldn't draw attention. The protagonist, hearing the shouting, also heard the two say that the mage, in that state, could no longer distinguish anyone. Upon hearing that, the priest asked the white corruption giant to throw him far away. The giant then grabbed the protagonist in its massive hands and hurled him with great force before vanishing. Meanwhile, the two girls were running. The pink-haired one begged to be released. Desperate to see the fight, the red-haired girl screamed even louder, saying all that noise would draw too much attention. But it was already too late. A loud crash occurred in front of them, and the protagonist was already waiting there. The red-haired woman froze in fear, her expression overtaken by despair, and everything got worse when she heard the protagonist's words about what would happen next. The pink-haired girl, on the other hand, felt a wild thrill watching that heavy aura approaching. With excitement, she said her name was Pearl and the other girl was called Bina. She looked directly into the protagonist's eyes with her violet ones, and revealed that they belonged to a secret society. The protagonist's expression grew even more serious upon hearing that. They worshipped the evil spirit. Opening her arms as if announcing thrilling news, she asked if he remembered the people from Kelton. He addressed the girl, and said he remembered very well who she was talking about. She then revealed that all of them had been part of Liberatio, just like she was, with the same crazy smile and wide eyes. She said that was why they were all waiting for the priest. Walking confidently toward her, he asked how many people were involved in that mysterious group. Young woman said she didn't know for sure. She was only there because they told her she could do whatever she wanted. With a delirious smile, she said that probably that strange mage knew a lot more about the organization. Pointing to a side where several people were being eliminated by a powerful lightning bolt, she said they were there for an important mission. In the direction of the lightning, it looked like the mage was collecting magic in a sinister manner. The priest didn't care about the mage at that moment. He wanted to understand Liberatio's goal more clearly. That's when the red-haired girl decided to speak, saying she would explain it very well. With her eyes closed and making a hand gesture, she declared their objective was far too simple. Suddenly she opened a half-crazed smile and stated, they wanted to create a new world. She said it would be a place where gods wouldn't exist, and no one would ever be persecuted for anything again. The priest simply closed his eyes and adopted a stern and angry expression right after he stared at the girl and asked if that was why she had burned down the entire city. He asked if that was really how they intended to start a world without persecution. Opening her arms, she said she didn't want that either, and blamed the mage for causing all the problems. To the priest, who was watching the girl closely, she said they still needed to collect a few things. When he heard that there was something he had that the group wanted, he became immediately interested. That's when she resumed that strange smile and fierce gaze, saying she wanted the relic he had. She was referring to the artifact held by the incarnation's body, the one he had taken from Kelton. Now the priest gripped the hilt of his serrated blade tightly, because his suspicion had been correct. Thinking of the goddess, he suspected that the group wanted a sacred relic containing her power. He told them that the artifact had been broken, and that made everything impossible. The girls thought he was lying. Something like that couldn't have been destroyed. The priest firmly declared that he had destroyed it himself and thrown the remains away. In Kelton, he took the opportunity to ask if there were other relics, like that one scattered around. It was a question not even his goddess had been able to answer. The girl, very excited, replied that yes, there were 4 of them in total. It became clear that the red-haired young woman didn't want that information to be revealed. The priest was astonished to learn that there were still 4 more relics, besides the one he had already destroyed, and his goddess, as the bearer of the sealed power, was beginning to visibly lose her temper, now with a twisted expression. The priest understood that he would need to find the other 4. Looking at those girls, he seemed eager to extract more information. With a fading voice he said he needed to know who had driven the citizens of that city insane. The pink-haired girl, smiling, said it wasn't her, as she didn't know how to do something like that. The red-haired one grew angry and yelled at her to shut up and stop giving away information. When the pink-haired girl replied that it was just a question, the redhead told her to stop talking to the priest. The priest, enraged, was simply watching, when suddenly the red-haired girl's head fell far from her body. The pink-haired girl was impressed, thinking his movement was absolutely spectacular. Even after he tried to do the same to her, she kept smiling, thinking he was simply amazing. The priest had also eliminated the pink-haired girl, but he knew that wouldn't be of much help. After the act, he told the goddess that he had done it for her and in her name. Now, by offering the body of young Bina, he earned 3,000 divinity points in return. Looking toward the young Pearly, he noticed her body was reacting strangely. Even without a head, the young woman remained alive as if she were truly immortal. Observing the city, he thought that now that the cause of the chaos had been eliminated, things would improve. With his hand on his chest, he wished for peace, but the goddess quickly warned him of something. At that moment, the priest heard someone calling him from the other side. Turning around, he saw his companions, who informed him that the crazy citizens had suddenly fainted. They wanted to know if the priest had anything to do with it, and he smiled and replied that yes, he did. Hearing that, Sajida asked if his spear had been of any help during the battle. The priest said he couldn't even express how useful it had been. While saying this, he thought it was fortunate that the man hadn't noticed anything unusual. This thought was about the corruption giant that had secretly helped him. The priest then suggested they keep moving, as something much greater was awakening. Carmen, as energetic as always, asked what it was all about, full of excitement, but he didn't have time to hear the answer, as an overwhelming noise filled the area. Looking to the side, they saw that a gigantic beast had awakened, made of remains and multiple eyes. The creature was so bizarre that, in addition to its many eyes, it had countless mouths scattered across its body. It seemed that the monster was absorbing the bodies it found. Along the way, the grotesque creature was so terrifying that even the cheerful Carmen was frightened, his face frozen in a bizarre expression. When he asked the priest if that thing was made of human bodies, antagonist replied that yes, it was staring at the abomination. He said that was exactly what he had just been talking about. He thought the mage's hobby was at the very least disgusting and completely absurd. The mage was detestable even after death, having gathered all those bodies together. Now he had become a completely despicable creature. Calling the mage's appearance, the priest thought that grotesque form matched his former authority perfectly. Looking at the white-haired young woman, he said he knew she was sad about having to eliminate some people. He said to her that he would comfort her as soon as everything was over. Hearing that, she smiled widely, enchanted by the promise, placing a hand on her chest. She asked how he planned to comfort her, and he, walking away, said he would think about it later. After a few steps, he looked back and said that before anything else, he needed to save the people and buy more time. Carmen was startled and asked if someone would come help them, if they managed to buy enough time. The priest affirmed with confidence, saying he was absolutely sure that would happen. While he spoke, Sajida looked in a specific direction and noticed someone approaching. Quickly seeing that, something caught the priest's attention as well, and he turned to look. The surgeon asked if it was who they had been waiting for, and if they had already arrived. With a trumpet, the trumpeter summoned his armies of undead to the battlefield. He led them all with a sound that only they could hear and understand. He seemed to have ordered all of them to attack the giant monster. Without hesitation now, the undead had eyes glowing with a strange bright blue light. Some of them to help tore at the monster's flesh with violent bites. There were many of them, and they were trying to bite and rip the monster apart, causing it some discomfort. This made the repulsive creature begin to howl furiously. While four figures watched the scene unfold, the young Dikia wanted to know what was going on with those unusually active undead. Pointing to the trumpeter, she asked if he was an ally or just another problem. The priest replied that he seemed to be an ally. As the man continued walking toward them, speaking to those present, the trumpeter said that among the four, he needed someone very agile to assist him, while saying that he held his spear in position too close to his own body. The agile one would need to grab and drive it straight into the heart of the deformed monster. After everything the trumpeter had said, the protagonist focused only on the object in his hands, and found it curious that it was a spear. Holding the spear handed to him by the trumpeter, the protagonist asked if by chance he didn't have a sword instead. That question was so unexpected that the trumpeter remained silent for a few moments. Then he opened his hand and made a sword appear floating in front of him. In awe, the protagonist watched as the entity handed him the sword. While he was still holding the spear with enthusiasm, the protagonist asked if that same gesture could summon 2 more swords, and maybe some arrows once again. The priest was surprised by the boldness of that man, in the presence of divine power. As the two spoke, the giant monster kept emitting its dreadful dreams, in the form of distorted roars. The trumpeter raised his index finger and summoned swords and arrows in the air that left the protagonist euphoric, as the trumpeter's power was truly impressive. Carefully examining the spear's tip, he noticed it seemed to be made of polished bone. Meanwhile, Carmen was testing her newly conjured bow with magical arrows. Seeing everyone excited with their weapons, the white-haired girl decided to swing her own sword with enthusiasm. She was thrilled to find that it was incredibly light and easy to handle. While Sajida examined his spear, the protagonist meanwhile gripped the sword's hilt, noticing how balanced and sharp it was. All the weapons had a perfect edge and were imbued with the divinity of the trumpeter of rest. Observing the monster ahead, the protagonist knew those weapons would be extreme, only effective against the undead. The trumpeter said he could interrupt the giant's movements for a while. He hoped that during that window, the group would be able to pierce the creature's heart with precision. The priest smiled eagerly, realizing he might get to keep the weapons if he helped the trumpeter of rest. Without hesitation, he grabbed his trumpet and began producing the sacred sound that would immobilize the giant. With that, the 4 warriors were ready to leap into action at any moment. As the sound echoed across the field, the monster thrashed violently. The sound waves also stirred the undead army, making them even more aggressive. Soon everyone could see that the monster was beginning to melt. In a grotesque manner, the young girl called the priest's attention to what was happening with the giant. She noticed that all the absorbed bodies were being expelled from the creature. The protagonist simply watched, intrigued, wondering what might happen next. He saw the monster melting before his eyes, but even so it remained gigantic and threatening. Though it was losing the attached corpses, it still seemed to have enough strength to fight. The protagonist thought he had to act quickly before the monster reabsorbed and solidified the bodies. The trumpeter explained that the thing was worse than the evil spirit worshippers themselves, and until now they had only dealt with its shell. He told the protagonist that the weapons he conjured had the ability to detect the true heart of the enemy. After that, he asked everyone to run as fast as they could toward the giant. He felt he still had more instructions to give, but didn't have the time, so they all advanced with determination, fully aware of what they needed to do. As they approached the mound, the protagonist realized that things could get worse at any moment. The monster ahead didn't seem able to move properly, which was a good sign behind him. Daikya also clearly noticed the creature struggle to keep its balance. Its grotesque body, made of countless corpses, was truly a horrifying sight. Despite many trying to reach the girl, she was faster and more cunning. At one point, she looked back and saw the monsters being shot by Carmen's arrows. Karma was covering the white-haired girl's rear, protecting her from a distance. The protagonist saw this happening and heard the girl say she would coordinate her attacks with Karma. Their plan was to attack the giant from below, gradually weakening it. Priest thought the strategy was excellent and assured them he would rely on their efforts. Right afterward, he called out to Sajida because he needed him to fulfill an important mission. He explained that it would be Sagitta's job to drive his spear directly into the monster's heart. Meanwhile, the protagonist would distract the creature's head. Sagitta took an offensive stance and began advancing, dealing with small monsters along the way. Meanwhile, the protagonist rushed quickly toward the giant's head. The fusion of undead stuck together was revolting, but he cut through them all with speed. He charged with fury, using his sword and moving like a living arrow toward the enemy. He believed there was a special reason to destroy the creature's head. First wielding the sword that emitted a green light, he remembered what the goddess had shown him. He knew there was a fragment of divinity, trapped right in the middle of the head. He was determined to shatter it completely, in order to eliminate the evil. Besides that, the face of the traitorous mage was embedded among the bodies, which enraged him even more. The protagonist stared into those detestable eyes and, with a resolute expression, decided to end the torment. Disgusting memories of that mage resurfaced in his mind, increasing his fury. Meanwhile, Sagitta was advancing silently toward the giant's vital organ. The protagonist stood before the mage's head, determined to slice it into 1,000 pieces, just as he had planned. He cut the creature's head into hundreds of parts. When he noticed there was still a remaining fragment, he decided to exterminate it completely. He raised his hand as high as he could, and brought the sword down with force. On the last piece he crushed what was left of the mustached mage, ending the most disgusting chapter of his past. Doing that left him deeply shaken, but also fulfilled like never before. The head of that bastard was finally destroyed, and with a slight smile he expressed his inner peace. Meanwhile, Sagitta had already positioned herself before the main organ, and was waiting for the right moment. At the exact instant, she drove her spear directly into the monster's heart. The giant thrashed in unbearable pain, until it began to vanish before everyone's eyes. The smaller monsters also disappeared around. The silver-haired girl was left confused. First, she didn't understand why the enemies had vanished so suddenly. Turning around, she noticed the reaction of the larger monster, which was now just a putrid puddle of corpses. The trumpeter observed everything from afar, with an expression of admiration and respect. He walked with his boots through the black sludge, while holding the purified core firmly. The protagonist, in turn, felt at peace for having fulfilled the vengeance he had long waited. His master Salvador could now rest in peace as the traitor had been completely destroyed. The one approaching the hero was the silver-haired girl. She watched him closely while asking if he had been hurt. He, noticing Sagitta's absence between the two, showed concern and asked where she was. Shortly after, Sagitta appeared, holding the spear and exclaiming how amazing that weapon was. Now that the four were finally reunited, they turned around and saw the trumpeter, that enigmatic figure, invited them to follow him to a specific location. He looked directly at the protagonist, and stated that the invitation was for him alone. Given that, the protagonist agreed to follow him, curious to find out what he wanted. As he walked, he stared at the trumpeter's back, wondering why he wanted to speak only to him. He considered the possibility that he had noticed the moment he picked up the sphere, or perhaps he had realized that he was a worshipper of the evil spirit. At a certain point along the path, the trumpeter stopped abruptly, and the goddess warned the protagonist to prepare himself. He then assumed a defensive stance, placing his hand on the sword's hilt and gripping it tightly. Soon after, the trumpeter warned that someone was approaching. The protagonist also sensed an intense and oppressive presence. He closed his eyes for a moment to try to discern what it was. That was when he noticed the approach of a multicolored aura, coming toward him despite its colorful glow. The presence was overwhelming, and carried an essence beyond human comprehension. While the trumpeter played his notes, the protagonist understood that what was approaching was part of a divinity. Looking more closely, he noticed that the trumpeter, for all the strangeness, maintained a relaxed posture. The masked man remained silent for a few seconds, merely observing him when he pointed his finger at the protagonist. The latter remained alert, waiting. The trumpeter then mentioned something about the capital, and right after knelt as if a higher force had compelled him to. Protagonist realized that the essence of the trumpeter had dissipated. Now he was staring at the mask used by the divinity to manifest. For a brief moment, upon seeing the mask dissolve, he thought it would no longer be possible to uncover the identity of that presence. But that didn't bother him. In fact, he didn't want to know anymore, and with that thought gave a slight smile. As the situation shifted, the trumpeter stood up and said they could now depart. Moving a bit away from the previous spot, they walked together. The protagonist expressed his desire to count on the trumpeter's help to cleanse the city of Urtico. However, the masked man stated it was not his duty to assist the living. His presence felt cold and indifferent, as if he had no intention of helping at all. Even so, the protagonist noticed that he had begun purifying a large part of the region. The protagonist then asked the trumpeter to search for possible survivors. If he found anyone, he was to take them to buildings that were still safe. Upon hearing this, the trumpeter switched instruments. Soon the undead began to stir once more. The protagonist's 3 companions, still amid the chaos, noticed a significant change. After completing that task, the trumpeter heard another request from the protagonist. With an eager expression, he asked that any food still in good condition be taken to the safe buildings. To fulfill the request, the trumpeter began to play once again. Once more he heard the protagonist's voice asking for another favor. Smiling, the protagonist was about to make another request when the trumpeter interrupted him, asking that he say everything at once. This time the hero wanted to hand over the priest's right arm to him, an item of great importance. As he gave the arm to the trumpeter, he said that it meant a lot holding the object in his hands. The trumpeter remained silent. Now he was surrounded by all his undead. Meanwhile, the priest watched the trumpeter, stunned that he was actually receiving help from him. The girl, surprised, asked if the trumpeter had really helped. The priest replied that deep down he was a kind person. As they walked, she asked if the protagonist had asked for help, and he confirmed that he had. Holding the priest's hand, the young woman thanked him in a romantic tone, acknowledging his effort to help everyone. Sometime later, back at the lodging, the little goddess was trying to absorb the power within the orb. Meanwhile, the protagonist remembered when the trumpeter tried to warn him. Now he believed the trumpeter knew. The protagonist was hand in hand with corruption. With an excited face, he told the goddess that he had met a god that day. He then decided to ask if she knew him, though he found it unlikely that she didn't. However, he remembered that she had said she didn't know, and didn't want to know. He thought that by saying that, the god's identity would remain hidden. Looking at the goddess again, he noticed she seemed to be dealing with severe irritation. In a moment of fury, she grabbed the orb and simply hurled it far away. Her face collapsed into tears. He asked if she was having trouble with the divine seal. He told her that even if she was angry, throwing things wasn't the best way to express it. In her childlike way, she looked away. He thanked her for the intention to help. He asked that no matter how frustrated she was, she avoid throwing the orb again. To cheer her up, he lifted her into his arms and raised her, drawing out a smile and a special sparkle in her eyes. The goddess asked if he thought she would become more charming by absorbing all the orbs. Before hearing the full answer, she was moved and began to cry, but he said she was already charming. She calmed down when she heard that to him. Nothing would change, he would still feel the same hugging his goddess. He said that even if she became 3 or 100 times more charming, he would always find her beautiful. Meanwhile, the lights at the lodging remained on. At one of the tables, a blue-haired woman listened to 2 friends talking about the evil spirits. She heard them say, those entities were not prison only in their kingdom, but also in the dragon realm in the east and in the desert. Upon hearing this, the blue-haired woman turned alert. She also heard someone say there was no need to worry anymore. After all, someone was eliminating the worshippers of the evil spirit, and they revealed who it was. They spoke of the priest Marnak. Now they toasted in his honor, wishing the priest a long life. As they celebrated, the woman remained seated, drinking her beer. At one point she muttered something about the hero of Urtico. Her gaze turned cold upon hearing Marnak's name. She walked down the corridor, thinking that, perhaps only the worshippers of evil relics should be cursed. However, the mercenary she had hired and even the lord of that place had already been eliminated. Now she would have to deal with that cold-blooded lizard. Because of that, she closed her eyes, trembling as she imagined the worst. She thought she would inevitably have to face that prince again, to whom she had promised never to fail again. That burly man believed that if he hid what had happened, he might only arouse that person's curiosity. Even overwhelmed by fear, he knocked on the door. After knocking, he remained waiting, expecting to be announced and granted entry. The prince, as usual, was reclining on his couch, but on that particular day, his eyes were fiercer than usual. In another scene, the protagonist rested his sword on the shoulders of a mercenary, would try to rob them along the way. Everything unfolded before the white-haired girl, who watched the scene with visible sadness. Her discomfort was so great that she turned her face away. Unable to keep watching, noticing this, the protagonist turned to her and said he would bury the men and return shortly. Keeping his word, he dug graves and placed a wooden cross, as if speaking to his goddess. It was a symbolic offering, and he asked her to gather the divinities of those who had passed. While performing the ritual, green flames manifested before him. He felt satisfied, as he had managed to collect a good number of divinities during the frequent attacks. Now walking through the snow once again, he stated they could resume their journey. While Carmen enjoyed chatting with Sajida, the protagonist and the girl remained silent. At a certain point he turned when he heard someone calling him. It was the girl trying to start some kind of conversation. She said she had no intention of criticizing him. She just wanted to understand. The princess asked him not to take her words the wrong way, while the protagonist watched her in silence. Still sad, she commented that he never showed any mercy to bandits. Seeing him quiet, she added that if he didn't want to talk about it, she would understand, pressing his lips together. The protagonist seemed deeply bothered. He then asked if she had asked the same question to the two smiling ones traveling with them. She replied that Carmen said he wanted to capture them to prevent further victims. Sajida, on the other hand, was simply doing the job he was hired for, but promised to spare them if she wished it. With a sly smile, protagonist raised a finger and said that, in his case, he did it because he saw potential. The girl thought maybe that's why he buried them with crosses, so they could be reborn. He explained that he believed in the bandits' potential for repentance, and their chance to become better. She deduced that then the best option would be to let them live, so they could shepherd others. Listening closely, she heard the protagonist explain that although he let them go, there was always the risk they'd return to evil. That's why he gave them a second chance. A chance to reincarnate. Even so, no matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't fully agree with him. She then asked if he believed humans had the authority to judge others. As she delivered that small sermon, she winked at him playfully while listening. The priest placed his hand on his chest and in thought told the goddess he understood how she felt. He remembered the day she had given him the authority to act as he saw fit. While Carmen and Sajida kept their usual relaxed atmosphere, the priest told the girl that he didn't judge anyone between taking responsibility for the bandits' actions or letting them go free to hurt others. He chose the first. He recalled the moment he stood before a grave, determined to cut off all potential threats. The girl said it all came down to a choice. With the sword on his back, he stated that one day he'd have to pay for everything he had done, but he firmly said that he was willing to pay the price, whatever it might be. With a serious look, he declared that he would never save an evil person, only to sacrifice a good one afterward. It was a painful experience to talk about, and he remembered the anguish he felt when he returned home. Just remembering it, he clenched his fists, convinced he would have to live with the consequences. He had sworn never to let an evil person live again, and now he shed tears remembering burying a friend. His words silenced the girl, who didn't have the courage to argue. Noticing that he remained deep in thought for a long time, she asked if she could tell him about her past. Then she hesitated if he didn't trust her. She didn't need to say anything. Smiling, he replied that maybe it would be better to wait for another opportunity. He soon pointed ahead, drawing her attention. Apparently a caravan of merchants was approaching. Carmen suggested they could sell the equipment taken from the bandits. Now the four of them were preparing for a possible negotiation with the travelers. They stood before a merchant who examined the items they presented. Upon seeing the protagonist's sword, the man commented that it was made of an immortal alloy, the pinnacle of the old empire. Then he apologized, saying he had gotten carried away, as he had never seen someone wielding a sword made of immortalium. That word sparked Carmen's interest, and he wanted to know more about this legendary alloy. The protagonist, observing his sword, remembered that he had found it alongside Carmen. The merchant confirmed it was a rare treasure of immeasurable value. When he tried to buy it, the protagonist simply hugged the sword and said it wasn't for sale. Carmen, curious, wanted to know what else the merchant wanted. The man revealed his desire to hire the group's services to escort him to the capital of the Northern Kingdom. He commented that before even seeing the sword, he had heard they came from Air Daiko, which meant the priest was the demon slayer from the city of Gis. He also knew about the curses from the evil deities of Kelton, and that he was the savior of Viridico. Looking at the protagonist, who was already coughing and visibly flushed, he said that if he was really a priest, then he was officially certified. He promised a generous reward if they agreed to escort him to the capital. Karm asked for a moment, so they could discuss the proposal among themselves. The merchant understood and left the tent, saying he hoped to return and hear good news. In the camp the atmosphere was calm. The goddess was stretching her bandage leg while receiving a shoulder massage. Priest massaging her asked if she was enjoying it. He seemed pleased and said they had decided to accept the job. He mentioned he would look for a good inn. Once they reached the capital, however, they heard a scream coming from outside the tent. Some people were trying to restrain a flying creature that was attacking the camp. The priest looked at the creature in terror, unsure of what it was. They soon realized they were being attacked by monsters with bat wings. The protagonist, recognizing the danger, embraced the goddess trying to protect her. Faced with the attack of the beastly bats, the protagonist promptly prepared to fight them. Gripping the hilt of his sword tightly, the priest cut down all those who crossed his path. Karmam, in turn, used her arrows masterfully to destroy them. Her incredible aim caused great havoc on the battlefield. Together they continued clearing the infested area. At a certain moment the protagonist's eyes glowed a deep green, as if possessed by some dark force. With that power he pierced one of the beastly bats with precision. During the battle the white-haired girl, a skilled mage, also helped with her magic focusing. She conjured fireballs and launched them at the enemies. In front of her a knight was attacked by a massive bat, but before she could act, the protagonist threw one of his swords at the creature. Thanks to that the man managed to escape, before being crushed by the fallen beast. The girl turned and smiled, pleased to see the priest. He then told her that an ally's magic, when poorly controlled, could be more dangerous than the enemy itself. Offended, she replied that she wasn't that bad. She claimed she could aim accurately and hit a bat that size. The protagonist, however, replied that there were no guarantees. A mistake wouldn't put an ally at risk. When he asked her to avoid using magic for now, she turned her back, visibly upset. After the exhausting battle against the bats, the protagonist was completely covered in the creature's filth. His sword also dripped with the dark liquid that oozed from them. It was in that state that he appeared before the contractor. The man looked at him and asked if he intended to keep that magnificent immortalium sword. Protagonist, with a serious gaze, said that would depend on the man's offer. The merchant understood the warning and knew he had to choose his words carefully. The priest warned him that worshippers of the evil spirit were attacking the merchant's organization, and demanded an explanation. The contractor replied that he also didn't know the reason for the attack. The protagonist then placed his sword on the table, a clear sign of tension, feeling the weight of the situation. The merchant stated that he trusted him, as the priest was a renowned figure. Sensing the man was telling the truth, protagonist calmed down and sheathed the sword on his back. Even so, he hoped the merchant wasn't hiding anything, although the man had asked for complete secrecy on matter. Smiling, the priest said he could keep a secret. After all, he was being hired. That's when the man asked one of his vassals to bring the item. After some time, the vassal returned with a box and placed it on the table near the contractor. The merchant explained that the attacks from the worshippers began as soon as that item had been delivered. The box had to be taken to the capital. That was the mission. The protagonist deduced that the group must have suffered several losses from ambushes along the way. When asked why he insisted on such a risky request, the man revealed he had been paid in immortalium. Curious, he asked the priest what it was, but the priest didn't know exactly what it was for either. Opening the box, the merchant revealed what appeared to be a simple necklace. However, the moment his eyes fell upon it, the protagonist recognized it. It was a sacred relic, and more than that, carried the divinity of his own goddess. Placing a hand on his chest, he felt its energy radiating in a green glow. He now understood why the worshippers were in pursuit. Filled with questions, He didn't know how the item had ended up in the merchant's hands, or how the enemies had discovered its location. The merchant wanted him to explain why those evil beings desired the necklace so badly. But the priest, with his head lowered, confessed that he didn't know either. With that, they changed the subject. Given the gravity of the situation, the priest stated that the mission's reward should be doubled, since the merchant had hidden a sacred item. The man turned pale upon hearing that. Reluctantly, he ended up agreeing. After all, he desperately needed the group's protection. At night, the tents were set up and the guards kept watch around them. Later, the four protagonists gathered, secretly analyzing the guards' equipment and discussing the situation. Carmen was especially pleased with the protagonist's decision to demand double the reward. Smiling, he replied that he had only asked for what they deserved. The girl, on her part, was simply happy that everyone was safe. They ended the meeting with a high five, and each one headed to their own tent. Meanwhile, the goddess's hand discreetly slipped through the protagonist's clothes. He whispered, asking if she wanted the sacred relic to be stolen, warning that it would be a disaster if they got caught. She, however, suggested it could be a perfect crime if there were no witnesses. Recalling the merchant's appearance, the priest considered that they shouldn't act recklessly. While comforting the goddess with his hand over his chest, he shared his plan. The idea was to let the evil spirits steal the item, and during the process recover it. They would capture the divinity and return the necklace afterward. Goddess's hand even glowed with excitement. Thinking the plan was brilliant, he suspected that the goddess was suspicious. The merchants were hiding something even greater. That was when he noticed signs of an ambush. Sighing, he lamented it was right after he had taken a bath. He almost activated his saw right away, determined to end it quickly. He shouted to the others they were under attack by monsters. This time a huge monster appeared, throwing guards around. Curious, the protagonist wanted to observe what kind of creature it was. Facing it, he saw it looked like a large goat, but that didn't matter. He intended to slice it up regardless. With a frightening expression, he raised both hands with his special sword. He launched a green light at the creature, which responded only with a terrifying roar. When he tried to cut the monster, it defended itself with its powerful horns. The protagonist raised his eyebrows, impressed by the enemy's strength. He tried another strike, but the goat continued to block the attacks. Seeing an opportunity, he decided to cut off the creature's horns. He was interested in them after the cut. The beast collapsed even though he had just cleaned himself. The protagonist was once again covered in filth, but something strange caught his attention. From the forest, an intense light emerged from the bushes, revealing a bizarre creature with huge eyes and a sinister smile. The protagonist widened his green eyes, trying to understand what it was. It was that pink-haired girl, now sticking her tongue between her lips, while being grabbed by the neck. Upon seeing her, the protagonist recognized her immediately. His green eyes locked on to her. The girl just flipped her hair and smiled provocatively. The men around blushed enchanted, even as she had her neck squeezed by the priest's hands. While he held her tightly by the neck, the girl asked if he had thought about her all this time. With an ambiguous smile, she said it was fine, because she had thought about him enough for both of them. He replied that if she didn't mind, there were a few questions he'd like to ask. With an enigmatic gaze and her hands resting on the protagonist's arm, she asked what he would give in return. Before that dialogue, the protagonist had been watching a different, fierce creature from afar. After fighting the beast, the monster's parts fell into the snow. While he moved toward the next destination, that's when a colossal animal appeared with deer antlers and red eyes. Rolling menacingly, however, that monster didn't have time to attack, as a swift spear from afar pierced its body with precision. The priest, realizing that the aid had come from an ally, made sure to give his sincere thanks. Carmen, on the other hand, was never off guard and quickly sensed something else approaching. So he warned his two companions about the new imminent danger. What was happening was that the monster, even wounded by Sagitta's spear, was still desperately trying to escape. Already clear on his own plans, the protagonist shouted to his friends to leave the rest to him. He would handle it with that. He dashed after the creature that was trying to flee through the snow. Despite the chase, the monster wouldn't have the strength to go very far. At a certain moment, the protagonist simply tightened his grip on his sword's hilt. He then prepared for a quick, precise and deadly throw. This time, He made sure the creature had been completely taken down. Right afterward, he retrieved his special sword, which remained embedded in the fallen monster's body. He walked once again through the white snow. Now more at ease, he climbed a nearby tree and apologized to the pink-haired girl for taking so long. As soon as he came down from the tree and walked toward her, she asked if he'd be willing to do everything she wanted. With a cheerful face and a wide smile, she wanted to know if he was serious or if it was just a joke. However, he asked that before anything else. She answered his questions. She then said she was ready for that. Looking straight at her, he asked how many worshippers of the evil spirit were still left. She had to think for a moment. Then, with a gentle smile, she replied that there were 3 more, not counting her with a displeased expression. She said the 3 companions didn't even share their plans with her. While the priestess complained, the priest thought that if she were in his group, he wouldn't trust her either. Trying to cheer herself up, she justified it by saying, those individuals acted that way because they were extremely cruel. When asked about the purpose of the attack on the merchant's caravan, she explained that they were supposed to steal a golden necklace belonging to the merchant lord. Smiling with curiosity, he asked how they knew about the necklace's existence. She admitted she wasn't sure. She said, only that the person who had given the necklace to the merchant was part of the Liberatio organization. To the protagonist, that seemed inconsistent, since the same organization was attacking the merchant. He then realized there must be some kind of split or internal conflict within Liberatio itself. The girl said it was something like mind games, moves between rival factions. With a lighter expression, he asked what exactly had caused the division between them. The girl replied that she knew but had forgotten. Facing the pine-covered landscape, he found it strange that she had forgotten something so important, considering she was part of the organization. With a mischievous smile, she replied that she was neutral and took any job, as long as she got paid in materials or money. He wanted to know what kind of materials she used. She explained it was for her dolls. As if that were obvious, bringing her hands together dramatically. She asked if he could understand her art. She also said she was a priestess who served the trembling thread. The protagonist, now with eyes closed, remembered the girl he had seen before. The one before him now was also a doll with arms open. She told him to be careful because her allies were scheming something. That information made him more serious and cautious. Then he asked why she was helping him. Clearly she didn't like the question. With a disturbing, almost deranged expression, she said that question was weirder than all the others. They both fell silent for a moment, as if reflecting on the strangeness of the situation. Turning his back to her, he declared that suddenly he was no longer curious. As he walked away, the girl lay down on the snow-covered ground and in a tantrum, asked him to ask again without turning around. He said it was her turn now. She could say what she wanted from him. Getting up with difficulty, her hair still covered in snow, she said she would tell him next time they met. He asked if she was sure about what she was saying. Since she didn't answer, he said goodbye with "they see you next time," and once again separated the doll's head from its body. Even with her head removed, she still smiled and said it had been a pleasure. Now the camp revealed itself with rows of tents all lit from within. The protagonist walked among them when he heard someone calling him. It was the white-haired girl, visibly concerned about him. He told her she should be in her tent resting, since worshippers could appear at any moment. She smiled and replied that she had been resting, but noticed he was gone and got worried. When she asked where he had been, he replied with a smile that he went chasing a carpello. Upon hearing that, he had sensed a worshipper's presence and gone to check. The girl became completely nervous. He, however, calmed her, saying the worshipper had already left. She stepped closer and said that was a shame. Right after, she took out a white handkerchief and gently wiped his face. He pulled back, saying she'd probably lose the handkerchief if she kept using it like that. But she insisted joyfully, saying she had brought that handkerchief especially for that. Holding his hand, she asked him to come closer and not run away this time. Then she carefully wiped his face again. She felt satisfied for having done it and said the rest he could handle himself. She left the white handkerchief in his hand. As she walked away toward her own tent, she wished the priest a good night. He, a bit flustered, entered his own tent suddenly. A green light appeared. It was the goddess holding a white handkerchief in her hands. Trembling with rage seeing her with the handkerchief, he smiled and said his face was already clean. There was no need to wipe it again. Even so, the goddess insisted, scrubbing forcefully, determined not to leave anything behind for others to touch. Sometime later, the group had already dismantled the camp and continued their journey. As the snow kept falling silently, something between the falling flakes and the distant silhouette of the mountain caught the protagonist's attention. He stopped admiring the scenery, noticing how the mountain was now completely covered in snow. He heard a strange sound, and then remembered the girl's words to be careful. He thought maybe it wasn't a trap, but his eyelids started to feel heavy. Suddenly the mountaintop exploded, triggering a massive landslide. The protagonist, on high alert, shouted for everyone to watch out for the avalanche urgently. He ordered them to abandon everything and run as fast as they could. However, something strange was happening. The white-haired girl kept walking toward the avalanche. Looking at the avalanche, he thought it was moving too fast and they needed to buy some time. When he looked at Dakia, he seemed to get an idea. He could use her to buy that time. The young woman didn't seem intimidated by the avalanche. Rapidly approaching them, the protagonist placed a hand on the beautiful young woman's shoulder and told her he would need her help. All those mercenaries were running back and forth, thinking they wouldn't be able to escape in time. Priest shouted that if she helped, they could save the people. He knew this was her weak spot, and that's why she turned and looked at him, though her gaze held some doubt. Haunting behind him, the protagonist asked her to use her magic on the avalanche. She found it strange that he would let her use her magic, but he told her that if she was going to use it, now was the time. She was confused because no matter which spell she used, none were strong enough to stop that phenomenon. The protagonist told her they didn't need to stop it, just slow it down enough for people to escape. She warned that she wouldn't be able to move while channeling mana, that she might faint afterward. Placing his hand on her shoulder, he told her it didn't matter what he had to do. Looking her in the eyes, he promised that he would protect her life. Even though she was scared, she trusted the priest deeply. Turning her back to him, she said she would try and warned that he better keep his promise. With his face illuminated, he heard her say that she was counting on him, and quickly she began to channel her mana, her hair rising surrounded by multiple streams of energy. All that mana swirled around the young woman, as if wrapping her in a vast magical cycle. She already held a small sphere in her hand. She took her stance and launched the attack in the agreed direction. As intended, her attack hit the avalanche directly. Now a blue explosion seemed to be shattering the problem. The explosion was so massive that the blue light and snow dust were seen from afar. Even so, the avalanche continued, just in smaller amounts. The young woman pushed herself even further, screaming non-stop. Her expression was now different, but focused, with veins bulging on her face. At that moment, the goddess of corruption evaluated the woman. At 4 fingers now, she had the best rating, having successfully mastered her magic. As she gained even more control over her power, her rating increased to 4.5 fingers. After all that power, the young woman stared blankly at something as if spaced out. Seeing that, the protagonist grabbed her and shouted for her to snap out of it. Holding her in his arms, he told her she had done a great job and that it was enough. Even though the avalanche was still falling, it was now moving at a slower pace. Now, with her unconscious in his arms, he thought he wouldn't have to knock her out. Then he asked his goddess to summon the great giant. The white giant of corruption appeared, and he shouted that there was no time to waste. He asked the great giant to protect him, so he wouldn't be struck by the massive avalanche. With that, only a few flakes of that ice passed near the young woman. As she kept her eyes closed, the corruption giant wrapped his body around the two of them, shielding them from the cold and any injury. After some time, the mountain was clear and all the snow had already fallen. The giant screamed as he looked upward. With some effort, he managed to form a sort of tunnel and came out of it safe and sound. As the protagonist walked through the snow, he spoke to the giant, saying that if there were no people in that area, he would need him to remove the stone lodged in his body. While he carried the young woman in his arms, she was still unconscious, but seemed to be showing signs of regaining her senses, and the protagonist's eyes were fixed and serious. As the giant of corruption removed the stone lodged near his head, he then entered a portal of corruption and vanished. Meanwhile, he looked at the girl, who asked him if she was still alive. He told her that he thought they had gotten separated from their companions, but all of them were still alive. Placing her on the ground, he asked if she could walk now. She said no. Her mana was still depleted. However, she told him that she had seen everything. When she said that, he looked at her with a tense jaw, thinking she might have seen the giant. With a more serious tone, she added that she saw when he summoned a very suspicious giant. Now his eyes widened even more and took on a green hue. Then she confessed that she already knew he didn't worship the goddess of preservation. Still kneeling on the ground, she looked up at his face as she said these words. She wanted to know exactly what he was hiding. She said that, first of all, he was different. Normal people didn't go flying around with swords. He tried to defend himself, saying it was due to personal training, but she knew that wasn't it. Then she said it was also about the hand he carried with him, and that she had heard him talking to himself. Now she was certain he thought he was being discreet, but over time, with her watchful eyes, she noticed smiling. He placed his hand on his chest and said it wasn't hard to tell. That left her a little dumbfounded. Then he said it was just a prayer. He always did. She said she pretended it was, but she had seen when he shouted the word mother, and a giant emitting a sinister energy appeared when she was about to ask him if he was a worshipper. He placed his finger on her lips and told her he had something to say. With a serious tone, he told her that people say silence is worth more than gold, and told her she hadn't seen anything. He said that since she was a fair person, he was sure she would understand the request. Lying in the snow, she said, it didn't matter whether he was a worshipper of the evil spirit or not. She looked at him and said he was a good person, even if sometimes merciless. Lying on the ground, she said she only brought it up because she thought he would listen without judgment. She explained that she was born a mage, which made many people look at her with resentment. She looked at him and said that, even if he were a worshipper of the evil spirit, she would still treat him the same. She also said she wouldn't keep that a secret. She was fragile and lying down but fully conscious. In that moment, neither the protagonist nor his goddess said anything. While he was still close to her, green energy was released. It was the goddess who had materialized, and was now giving light punches, several of them to the white-haired girl's head, taking advantage of her vulnerable state. Looking at the child, she asked where she had come from, and asked the priest to make her stop. The priest held the goddess's hand and asked her to calm down, saying he believed the young woman was telling the truth. He told the goddess that he understood she was worried, but he wanted to try trusting the young woman. While the white-haired girl looked at the protagonist, she told the goddess that since she was a mage, she would ask her to swear an oath. Then the goddess made it clear to the girl that she was constantly watching her. The girl asked the priest what that meant, and he said it meant the goddess would be watching her behavior. Helping the girl to her feet, he told her she would need to swear using the ancient language, and with that, the girl began to pronounce the oath in the requested language. As she started to make the oath, her mana began to surround her as if sealing a contract. This calmed the priest, because he knew she wouldn't be able to speak about it, even if she wanted to now. The girl looked at him and asked if he hadn't considered that she could have lied during the oath, but he told her he knew about the ancient language, and that made her intrigued and even more curious. He looked at her and asked what she wanted to know about him. She, blushing and touching her hands, wanted to know what type of woman he liked. That atrocity uttered by the girl could be heard, which made the goddess still in her childlike form, completely furious. With a gesture of disapproval, she immediately pushed the two apart. The priest, noticing the goddess's fury, suggested to the girl that it would be best if they moved on without delay. Still visibly embarrassed, the young woman asked if he truly intended to search for the sacred relic. The next scene revealed several people collapse on the thick, white snow-covered ground. The three worshippers of the evil spirit had already resolved the previous situation, and were now in possession of the box. Upon examining it, they saw that the relic remained intact, undamaged. While they assumed the priest had been frozen to death, he and the girl were calmly walking along another trail. One of the worshippers, a young woman with short bluish hair and eyes of the same shade, was eager to leave quickly. The man beside her, with long black hair and almond-shaped eyes, sensed a hostile presence approaching. Soon the three of them were on the snow, observing a figure who seemed to have followed them. The approaching person was consumed by rage, accusing the worshippers of destroying the merchant organization. That figure, one of the guards responsible for the relic's protection, shouted indignantly, asking how they dared take what didn't belong to them. The blue-haired worshipper began gathering magical energy in her hand, ready to attack right after casting her spell of the man. The field was covered by ice spikes that emerged suddenly. However, the man remained standing, his body practically untouched. There were only a few visible flaws on his metallic surface. When his outer structure was finally broken, he was revealed to be a violent android wrapped in hostile energy. It was said that androids had bodies made entirely of metal, and were known for their obsession with rare minerals. They coveted all types of valuable metals, becoming incredibly powerful in their presence. They would not stop moving as long as their cores were active, and that was exactly the case with the android. Now standing before the three, consumed by rage, he began to reconfigure his joints, adapting to the imminent battle. Even the experienced mage admitted it was difficult to fight a cyborg using conventional magic. The enemy dodged the ice attack with ease, and transformed one of his arms into a weapon. He began moving on 4 legs for greater stability, claiming that childish tricks wouldn't be able to stop him. The blue-haired worshipper now found herself in serious trouble, a risk of death if she continued to fight. One of her companions asked her to hang on a bit longer, no matter the difficulties. However, the girl turned to her 2 allies and asked them to act quickly, as she wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. Meanwhile, the cyborg remained berserk. With his steel body, it was clear he wouldn't be affected by freezing. He confidently declared that the 3 of them wouldn't be able to defeat him. However, the black-haired man's eyes showed a different kind of certainty. Seeing that his allies' magic was failing, the cyborg advanced on the 3 of them. The black-haired man calmly raised 1 foot, pressing it to the ground with force, initiating a threatening movement, as if triggering a trap. A black slime began to envelop the cyborg's metallic parts. Soon he was struggling to move, since he moved on 4 legs. The adhesive substance precisely immobilized his limb. Beneath the enemy's feet, there appeared to be an intense dark magic finding him in place. The girl praised Pelham's work, saying she could now unleash her full magical power. With a strange smile and eyes filled with madness, the mage summoned her. Melting ice spikes formed and began to attack the cyborg. Within the spikes, a fierce whirlwind appeared surrounding the creature, protecting only part of his face. The cyborg mocked the technique, calling it a cheap trick using his sword. He broke the ice that was bothering him, and also dispelled the magic cast by the first mage. The woman, upon witnessing that, grew visibly tense as seen in the way she furrowed her brows. One of the allies, a red-haired young man, told Karuna to duck. He then cast a strange magic that appeared before them like a barrier. Among all the spells cast, that was the only one that truly surprised the Tin Man. Magical creature summoned by the mage began to release a sticky nectar. That liquid coated the Iron Man's gears, causing significant discomfort. Overcome by irritation, the cyborg was showing signs of being extremely affected. Taking advantage of the distraction, the ice witch launched another attack. The red-haired boy with ruby-colored eyes smiled, saying the enemy had underestimated the wrong people. With the cyborg knocked down, they revealed that they had already known from the start that the real owner of the merchant organization was merely an android. The ice mage was curious to discover what had been expelled from the magical creature. Since the cyborg was still riding during the conversation, a white creature approached, drawing everyone's attention. That put them on high alert. It was the white giant of corruption, running toward them with wide strides and unshakable speed. The ice witch asked what they should do in the face of this new threat. The insect boy admitted he could no longer stop, as his creatures were useless against something like that. The blue-haired woman asked about the pink-haired girl, but they decided they would face the creature even without her. Once again, the witch summoned the power of melted ice, creating spikes to try to slow it down. However, all she managed to do was further enrage the white giant of corruption. Not even the ice wall was enough to stop. The girl begged Sheldon to do something immediately, or else they would all be doomed. The dark-haired man devised a strategy, and decided to surround them in a pit of mud. To protect them temporarily, the giant of corruption prepared a powerful attack that destroyed the ice barrier, and also the magical creature. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued, carrying the weakened white-haired girl in his arms. He asked her if she could walk and with tenderness, gently placed her on the ground, letting her feet touch the snow. Standing firmly, she said she was feeling better. The protagonist said she didn't need to help, considering her weakened state. Even so, he asked her to just observe. She opened her eyes and saw ahead the figure of a quadruped android. That merchant remained armed and full of fury, determined to eliminate all worshippers of the evil spirit. Despite some damage to his structure, he continued strong in battle. He advanced, destroying the giant bats that the mage had summoned. The young priest told the girl he wanted to help, but it seemed the man was handling the situation well on his own. From a distance, the priest noticed that the cyborg was at a disadvantage, outnumbered and beginning to falter. However, something caught the protagonist's attention. His green eyes shone intensely like emeralds. He observed the giant of corruption and noticed something strange about the way it fought. There was something unusual in its movements and in how it executed its attacks. Then it picked something up and threw it forcefully far away. The object landed hard in the snow, raising a white cloud of ice. Landed very close to the protagonist, who approached to see what it was. As he got closer, he realized it was a snowfield bat, already lifeless. It was at that moment that the goddess's hand appeared before him. She seemed to be communicating with him directly, expressing the desire to act. At that moment, the appearance of the monster made the white-haired girl nauseous, and she began to feel sick. To the protagonist, however, it was just another repulsive animal. Upon opening the bat's body, he found the sacred relic hidden inside. From afar, the white giant of corruption waved, showing off a jewel and blushing slightly. That was when the protagonist understood why it had been acting differently. It was the goddess's doing, and so he gave a slight smile. Suddenly, an intense light enveloped the protagonist. He was about to enhance one of his persistent authorities. He chose which one to strengthen, taking advantage of his accumulated divine power, which had already reached 13,000 units. He wished for the giant of corruption to be strengthened as well. Thus a sphere of light enveloped it completely. The blessing didn't only affect him. The giant of corruption also received a significant enhancement. The intense light emanating from that massive creature blinded the bats, which were each destroyed with ease. They were like arrows of light, shooting from the capsule surrounding the giant of destruction. From a distance, the priest watched and smiled like never before his eyes, witnessing something truly majestic. He gazed at that giant of corruption, now even more shielded with a deep feeling of pride. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye-bye.